very much. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this virtual meeting of the North Carolina Secretaries Science Advisory Board. Thanks, as always, to Dr. Franny Nielsen for working with the leadership of the agencies and the divisions therein to develop the agenda that we have today. And today, thanks also to Stephen Rice for IT support. We've already put him to work on problem solving. You probably reach him in the chat. If for some reason you would get disconnected and need him, it's Stephen with the v.rice at deq.nc.gov. That's going to be the best way to get help if for some reason you would jump out. I want to thank all the board members for attending. I heard from everybody that they plan to attend with the exception of Gina, who's away from the office. So it's great that we got so many people. I'm aware that some of you have to leave early. If you can rejoin after those other commitments, great. If you can't, I'll remind you that all the presentations are recorded and usually in about a week they're available on YouTube. A reminder that the meetings are recorded, and so please pay attention to your microphone. Maybe put it on mute when you're not talking. When you have a question or a response for the benefit of the recording and those listening, come back on camera and make sure your microphone's on, things like that. Just be mindful that the meeting's being recorded and we're all trying to participate virtually. I think that's it for all of the reminders that I have. So I'd suggest that we move on to a first item of business, which would be to review and approve our draft agenda, which was sent by Franny on July 23rd. And I haven't heard of any suggested changes so far. Are there any questions about the draft agenda? And let me ask too, before we approve it, has anyone signed up to speak during the public forum? Because if they have, we might want to get to them when it's topical.
Just before the meeting started, no one had signed up, but
Okay.
I will ask Catherine again.
We can revisit it later at the end. Good morning, David. Thanks for joining. Hope you're having a good summer. Thanks for making time for this today. Let's see. Hearing no changes to the draft agenda, it would be appropriate for a motion to adopt it as drafted.
So moved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Great. So we've got an agenda that includes just a couple of compulsory circle type business items early and then 3 presentations. The presentations all relate to things the board's touched on, either a deep dive, like in the case of PFMOAA, or tangentially in the case of consumption advisories that we helped out. We did some work on consumption advisories related to water quality standards earlier, and thermal exposure has come up a few times as whether or not it was an important route to consider as we work on PFAS type of work. So I'm going to do the vote as a roll call since we're not together to see each other's hands. In favor or not of approving the agenda as drafting, which is the motion. So Vinay?
Yes.
Thank you. Jamie?
Proof.
Thank you. Rich?
Approve.
Thanks. David?
Approve.
Thanks. Elena?
Approve.
Detlef?
Approve.
Thank you both. Tom?
Yes.
Thank you. And John?
Yes.
All right. Well, the agenda is approved. With nobody else who has asked to speak. I think that moves us on to the ethics statement. Franny can put it on the board and I'll go ahead and read it. In accordance with the State Government Ethics Act, it's the duty of every board member to avoid both conflicts of interest and the appearances of conflict. If any board member has any known conflict of interest or is aware of facts that might create the appearance of such conflict, With respect to any matters coming before the board today, please identify the conflict or the facts that might create the appearance of a conflict to ensure that any inappropriate participation in that matter may be avoided. If at any time any new matter raises a conflict during the meeting, please be sure to identify it at that time. So with that, the floor is open for anyone who has a conflict or the appearances of a conflict to address it.
Sorry, my raised hand function isn't working, but I just want to make a statement if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I do have funding from the state of New Jersey to study the toxicity of PFAS, specifically the immunotoxicity. And I do actively serve as an expert witness in cases that concern PFAS.
Noted.
And I have also external research funding, both federal and from the state of North Carolina, to study PFAS occurrence and human exposure routes.
Noted as well. Thanks for those disclosures. I don't know that any charges will come from the presentations today. We certainly wouldn't be voting on anything today so quickly after presentations. So thanks for your disclosures, but feel free to participate even in the PFAS topics as they come up today to the extent that you feel comfortable doing so. All right, cruising right through the agenda. It's time to look at the meeting minutes from our April meeting. The minutes of the April meeting were sent in draft by Franny on July 23rd, along with the draft agenda. I've looked them over. Franny, I made a couple of typo type fixes, and I think they're good to go, but the floor is open for any questions, corrections, or proposed edits. And I think we'd be in good shape if we were just to take the very first word up there from agenda and strike that and make it minutes or final minutes. Perfect. With that change, it would be appropriate to entertain a motion to approve the minutes as drafted with this modification.
So moved.
Thank you. Do we have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Detlef. I'll do the roll call vote again. Vinay? You might be on mute.
Approve.
Thank you. Jamie?
Yes.
Thank you. Rich?
Approve.
Thank you. David?
Approve.
Thank you. Elena?
Approve.
Thank you. Detlef?
Approve.
Thank you. Tom?
Approve.
Thank you. And John?
Approve.
Great. 90% board attendance. That's great. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. I think that moves us on now to agency updates. And I guess I will, I don't see that Zach has been able to join, and I think he was going to start with, for DHHS. So let's start with DEQ. And I will ask Sushma or Franny to handle that. Or if we need to wait for somebody to rejoin, we can do that as well. Can't hear you, Sushma. Not yet.
No.
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay. I only clicked 4 buttons to see if that would work. Okay. This is what happens when we go from Teams to WebEx. You can imagine. So Franny, I have a few slides that I just cobbled together early this morning with maps. Would I be able to share in a second?
I just made you a presenter, so you should be able to.
Okay, give me a second, everyone. Thank you. Great. All right, can you see this slide deck?
Not yet.
Not yet? Okay.
Yeah.
How
Now
about
we
now?
can see it.
Cool, thank you. This is new too. All right, so I'm going to give a quick update. As you know, a lot of activities going on at DEQ and across the state are related to emerging contaminants. Today, I'll do a high-level overview of a few areas our department is very active. I'll cover the Bernard Allen private well testing program. There's been a significant amount of increased activity. I'll cover a few things going on here. And then our ongoing Comores consent order testing that continues after 8 years. I'll cover a new legislation in the budget that North Carolina General Assembly passed that contains a very significant mandate related to PFAS and emerging contaminants. For now, I'll cover the Water Safety Act at a very high level, but you'll see us talking about this in more detail in the future. And then there are a few things happening at the federal level. I'll highlight for you all just regs related to drinking water and other areas of the environmental federal acts that are active on the PFAS front. And then finally, there's been an initiative by EPA and Comores to settle into a West Virginia accord for their operations across 3 states. And I'll give you a highlight of that. So just getting started, this is just 5 slides for this morning. As you know, our action strategy for PFAS is a whole of DEQ approach to look at PFAS in a multimedia approach across communities and across sources that contribute to that. Our primary goal remains the same. Our goal is to protect communities by identifying those areas that may have levels above safe drinking water requirements or regulations. That also means protecting drinking water through the existing authority we have, through regulatory authority that EPA is giving us through a delegation program, and then ongoing additional tools we have in the toolbox to address sources of contamination. We're also working with the EMC to move forward with however the commission wants to proceed with their proposed rulemaking. And if there are any questions, I can talk about the status of that. And then finally, we're working with some targeted sites and industries to address existing contamination. We've done consent order, what we call special order of consent, and then other ways to get voluntary actions into the queue. So with that, I'll start with the Bernard Allen program. You've seen our Division of Waste Management folks come in the past talk about what this program is. It basically allows our program team to visit home sites with groundwater wells. And we test them for specific contaminants. It's been increased to PFAS testing. That program has been, we ran out of money. We were able to successfully get the legislature to help us fund a pretty good amount in the Water Safety Act to keep the program going, but also the need for private well testing continues to increase. We're also adding additional funding from EPA to expand the testing across the state. And what are we testing for in PFAS? For now, while these MCLs or maximum contaminant levels are in place by the EPA under the Safe Drinking Water Act, we are testing these wells for these constituents. And if they are exceeding any of these levels, including those under the Comores consent order, then we bring them into some relief plan, whether it's the consent order or the Bernard Allen program. And usually it's getting those homeowners on bottled water first, and then going through our other programs to get them on filtration or municipal connections. And that's been our strategy thus far. Note that EPA has recently proposed to keep only the top two, the PFOA and PFOS, in the regulations, and they have announced a proposal to repeal the rest of the standards. So going back to Bernard Allen, the North Carolina Collaboratory was funded by the North Carolina General Assembly to look at PFAS in and around fire stations. So they have been working on a plan with the Division of Waste Management to prioritize sampling and testing of wells at fire stations, both the source water as well as the wells themselves. And Detlef is leading that work along with other professors at the Collaboratory. Based on the findings of the Collaboratory's work, they identified priority fire stations based on the level they found for additional communication and awareness to the firefighters. And then we joined the program to begin sampling around those fire stations. And this is a pretty large effort, one of the largest ones we've done thus far. And what you're seeing here is the Bernard Allen program mobilized at each one of these red sites where the fire stations are that the Collaboratory has tested. We are sampling in a step out program of all the private wells that exist around each of these fire stations. And most of it is, as you can see, is in the Piedmont region, a few in our own backyard here. This table, and I'll provide this to Franny, so it's on the website. This table shows individual fire stations and the number of samples we collected. We are finding exceedances above those MCLs, and those homeowners are being put on relief plans immediately. We don't have results for all sampling. We're continuing to sample. Some of the findings are we're finding 2 digits, 3 digits, sometimes 4 digits in PFOA, PFOS levels at these sites. So the work continues. I just wanted the SAB to be aware that as we suspected and as everyone knows, PFAS is everywhere. We have to get a better understanding of how it's affecting drinking water quality and getting homeowners into a safer option. Moving on to Comores, you've seen this map before. This is our 10-county assessment area that's in the southeast part of the state. Jared Wilson produced this map along with our Division of Waste Management and all of our divisions that are working out there. But basically, the Comores assessment consists of near site assessment, and that's this area that I'm pointing at now. There's the area, the floodplain area in between, and then there's all the lower Cape Fear, where the contamination travels through air deposition, and also flooding, and also leaking pipes. So what you see here is majority of the hits over the consent order criteria are still. We're at about 32 miles from the center of the facility, and then all near Pender, Brunswick, and New Hanover counties. Thus far, we're looking at over 15,000 or so wells, maybe more, 22,000 wells have been tested. And the stats here show how many are under RO systems and how many are full house GAC eligible. So we're looking at about 10,000 or so wells that are currently under the consent order. On the right here, you see the Bernard Allen program, and those are exceedances outside of the Comores consent order. They're those MCL exceedances. And then there we're seeing about 600 or so wells, and it's going to expand as we get to other parts of the state. And those are my maps. The only other updates I wanted to, I'm hoping I'm not sharing anymore. The only other update I wanted to give you is at the federal level, the EPA has proposed to retain the PFOA and the PFOS drinking water standards. They're proposing to repeal the rest of them, not on the merits of it's not toxic to humans, but according to their proposal, that EPA didn't follow the appropriate procedures for setting those into rulemaking. We as a department have commented opposing that move and put in context to how important it is for North Carolina to have expeditious and consistent and regulatory certainty associated with drinking water standards. It is really the bedrock of how we're proceeding with protecting our communities. We know these PFAS chemicals are toxic, and we just would like EPA to continue expediting that work. On the second front, you've actually listened to me about the Clean Water Act, which is the other part of the federal authority that allows dischargers to be regulated so that they're not adding contamination that are toxic to our waters. That work is still ongoing. We're hearing from EPA that effluent guidelines may be coming out soon for wastewater systems. We really are looking forward to that. In fact, all states are, because that will really allow us to take additional steps to protect our surface water discharges. In the meantime, the Environmental Management Commission has proposed minimization rules to require industries to voluntarily reduce discharges of PFAS through best management practices. Those rules are under final review. We're putting a hearing officer's report together, and eventually it should come to the EMC for additional discussion and taking ultimate action on those proposed rules. And then finally, the Water Safety Act that I mentioned contains somewhat similar monitoring requirements as the EMC rules, but it is very specific in what they want the DEQ and the collaboratory do. Mainly, they want all of the industrial sources to be tested in year 2, and POTW's wastewater systems that are under DEQ control to be tested in year 1. So we're working with the collaboratory to develop a very aggressive sampling plan. We could be out sampling at least 500 plus sites in the next 1 to 2 years, with a tune of maybe, I don't know, I'm quoting here, between 50 to 100 a month. It's unprecedented to manage water sampling for PFAS from multiple streams and complicated industrial operations to do that. So we have a good, smart team of people, and we'll give you updates as we move forward on what that looks like. And then finally, there's other provisions in the Water Safety Act that will be of interest to you all, and we'll continue to give you updates later. But I'll pause here. Sorry for the lengthy update, but it's been a while since we met. So, any questions?
Thank you, Deputy Secretary Macemore. We appreciate it. And yeah, between that Bernard Allen program, the fire station work, the consent order work with Chemours, there's an awful lot of impressive exposure assessment and risk reduction going on, even around all of the varying views on the status of the toxicity. So that seems great. Are there questions for Deputy Secretary Macemore? Jamie, I see your hand. And then I see
Thank you.
Elaine.
Yeah, for some reason, the raise hand function isn't working on my
Oh,
end.
yeah.
So this is just 2 points of information. And you're probably aware of this, that during the public comment period where people could provide oral comments to the EPA proposals to delay and rescind, I did not hear any support for the proposals. And I understand that the vast majority of written comments also support or do not support the proposals. And also, if you're wanting to see a little bit of action in Congress, I think there is a congressional letter being sent or has been sent to the EPA. It was initiated by Senator Schiff's office, basically to assert that the EPA doesn't have the authority to even submit proposals like this once laws have been passed. So I think some are urging that this be played out in a court of law, not in the way that the EPA is doing it right now. So I'm glad that you all submitted comments. I was going to ask if you did, and I'm glad to hear that you all did.
Yeah, good points. Both of those, there's a lot of activities for and against. I think there's concerns over the timing, and EPA is planning to give option to extend it, but really it's the repeal of it and then still saying they're going to come back to that. And I think Gen X being brought into that repeal is of concern to us. There's a concern around, we call it in our world, backsliding. That means that once a regulation is put in place, then those regulations are permanent to an extent, and then repealing it and creating a vacuum or a void builds issues under the Clean Water Act. So that might be litigated extensively. We just hope it doesn't end up in court for years and years and nothing happens on the actual front. So we'll see.
Thanks for the question, Jamie. And Elena, you had a question?
Yes, I was wondering how soon after it's collected is this data made publicly available, or is it made publicly available in terms
Good
of the
question.
levels
Elena, the first
measured?
thing we do is once we have the private well results, and if they're over these levels, we inform the homeowner right away. We call them up, we send them a letter, we talk to them about what this means, we explain what our options are. We've done it enough that I think it's a very systematic process. And then our team on a weekly, sometimes even monthly basis, creates summaries of what all of the data looks like. So like the chart you saw, they're tabulated summaries. All of this is available to the public. Most of this is on our website. We're still trying to catch up with all of the work going on. But I think we'll revisit to make sure that at least at some intervals, all of these mapping data and then tabulated data are available on the website. I will say that the Bernard Allen program, like I said, was operating under a really thin margin. We have now additional funding where we're staffing up, and one of those staff is going to be used for mapping and data systems so that we can engage with the public more readily and faster and easier. So that would be an ongoing thing. Under the Water Safety Act, they're telling the collaboratory that those reports will be produced after each year of testing, and the collaboratory is going to produce those reports, not DEQ.
Thanks for the question and the response. John?
Sushma, I think your map was showing a very impressive array of sampling sites that have been done. And I think that's extremely important for people to have some sense of what's going on with their water. I've seen that just a few weeks ago, you know, we're going to have a focus here. We have had a focus for years now on PFAS and PFOA, but a couple of years ago, there was a discussion about 1,4-dioxane. And by way of kind of letting people know, on the ethics side of things, I worked for the state as an expert witness a couple of years ago on 1,4-dioxane. But there seems to be recent releases again from a plant near Asheboro that's gone into ultimately into the Cape Fear River. And Is there any effort to look at wells outside of just the river itself in terms of 1,4-dioxane concentration? I'm thinking over the horizon here, Kenmore, as we thought, was just very focused, and it turned out to be a much bigger area. Could 1,4-dioxane be another kind of pollutant in the same fashion that you've got more broad scale contamination of water than we actually realize? Because it also is a tough one to deal with. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a really good, we have thought about it. And in some of our ambient groundwater sampling, we have done 1,4-dioxane sampling that a while back to get a understanding. We have 200 plus ambient monitoring wells. I don't know to what extent it's complete in terms of full characterization across the state, but we have done, our Division of Waste Management has done 1,4-dioxane at industrial sites and surrounding wells. As to what level our routine sampling for private wells consists of 1,4, it's an additional expense. I'm not sure whether we have the funding to do that, but I think it is worth noting that there are probably some priority areas that we should look at. Let me look into it and get back with you what we do have and where we are doing additional sampling.
Yeah.
I will say that the 1,4-dioxane issue, our staff do believe that the sources contributing to that continues to be a limited number, and that unlike PFAS, it's more isolated in terms of its discharge into the waters and ultimate movement into other parts of the state, which is downstream. And it's more time oriented than being dispersed and just finding it as a steady state across all waters. But we just don't have a sampling program to characterize that well.
Yeah, I guess my point is that it may be useful at least to look at some sources surrounding that facility. They're not in the water itself, but in people's groundwater in the surrounding neighborhood. Maybe not extensive, but just some sense of, is there contamination outside of the actual industrial facilities themselves into people's drinking water sources? So anyways, thank you very much.
No, it's a good point. We'll look into that. Thank you. Hey, Tom, you're on mute.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen, for enabling the hand raise function. I do see that left though.
Okay, unmuted now. Maybe just to follow up on Sushma's response, I think, in the Water Safety Act, 1,4-dioxane is called out, and if all the sampling goes according to plan, we will likely include 1,4-dioxane in the effort. So there will be maybe also a very broad characterization of 1,4-dioxane inputs through POTWs and SIUs. And the initial focus is really on PFAS, but the legislation is written a little more broadly, so it does mention emerging contaminants and 1,4-dioxane in particular.
Well, I'm glad to hear that.
Other questions from the presentation or just in general for Deputy Secretary Macemore? All right, thank you for the newsy update. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
I know from talking to Virginia earlier that Zach was going to help do the DHHS update. Have y'all worked that out?
Unfortunately, he was unable to join, so I can just provide updates on behalf of DHHS. Good morning, everyone. Virginia Guidry, Head of Occupational and Environmental Epidemiology at DHHS. I'll just start really high level on a couple of topics that Zach was going to talk about that have been in the news. Cyclosporiasis has been a major effort at DHHS, and the response to that foodborne illness Thankfully, the numbers are starting to come down. For any of you who live in Wake County, you know that's where a lot of the impact was in our state. So that's been a big effort for DHHS. And then also just briefly mentioning Ebola, which is, you know, a continuing concern. Of course, there is an outbreak that is uncontrolled in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And here in North Carolina, what we're currently doing is monitoring travelers who are returning. And those are, of course, the travelers that we know about. So there are folks in North Carolina across more than 10 counties that are being monitored for Ebola. And so just kind of mentioning that for the realization that this concern is here at home as well as overseas. And, you know, and obviously a very, very concerning illness there. Moving on to more topics, I'll share kind of some of our more traditional updates. So thanks, Sushma, for all the review of the ongoing activities that DEQ is engaged in. Here at DHHS, we are continuing to discuss potential fish advisories. Today, I'll be providing an overview presentation on the Great Lakes Consortium for Fish Consumption Advisories guidelines and for PFOS, and looking for your feedback on those guidelines today. And then we are also continuing to review the emerging literature on dermal exposures to PFAS as more PFAS measurements are occurring in people's private wells. We are regularly asked about dermal exposures. And so we're presenting an overview of the literature on that today, and also very interested in your feedback and input on that. We are assisting DEQ as needed with the response to PFAS contamination in private wells near fire stations and elsewhere around the state. For the fire stations, we're interested in both the occupational health concerns for firefighters as well as the community impacts around those fire stations. And along those lines, we've been attending several meetings with Dr. Heather Stapleton from Duke, where she's explaining the results to firefighters to understand their occupational and community concerns and help to be engaged in that process. Just briefly on 1,4-dioxane, which has already been raised, we are working on a webpage that summarizes the available health information on 1,4-dioxane in drinking water, and that should be posted soon. We are also continuing our work to support the areas of the state that face environmental justice concerns. And we presented at the Council of State and Territorial Epidemiologists Conference in June about state-level environmental justice work and our efforts to increase the inclusion of environmental justice and environmental health disparities in community health assessments that were completed and published in 2025 by local health departments. We were able to include or encourage the inclusion of 13 environmental justice chapters in local health departments' community health assessments, and 30 local health departments included a map of the CDC Environmental Justice Index. So we're very pleased with that work to continue to raise that awareness and those concerns with local health departments. We are also continuing to purchase and distribute water filters in underserved areas with private well contamination from a range of sources. For example, in Sampson County and some in Robeson County. And we are focusing right now on distributing replacement filters as well to households who have received pitcher filters last year. We're also attending meetings around the state to understand more about environmental justice concerns near proposed data centers, a recycled asphalt plant, and PFAS exposures. And environmental justice hasn't been at the heart of the PFAS response thus far, but I will say that it's increasing in concern. And it does sound like there's going to be a meeting this fall around environmental justice and PFAS in parts of our state like Robeson County that a number of community partners are organizing. I will also mention a couple of other efforts. It's heat season right now. It's been very busy at DHHS. In May, our climate and health program, along with the State Resilience Office at DEQ and State Climate Office and National Weather Service, hosted a heat season kickoff where we provided information to local government staff to highlight health risks of heat exposures and provide tools and resources that they can use. We have currently seen over 4,400 emergency department visits for heat-related illness this season, which is similar to the about 5,000 that we had seen for the same period, up till early August in 2025. And our average weekly rate is 2.9 visits per 100,000 people in the state. We do typically, and we are seeing this summer we see more heat-related illness in males than females, especially in 25 to 44-year-old males, which may be occupational, and also in 65 plus males. And as you all likely experienced, our heat waves in June and around July 4th, we did see spikes in emergency department visits during those heat waves. So we continue to promote health prevention messaging and provide tailored reports by region so our local partners can take public health action around heat when warranted. And then the last topic I just want to raise is the drought. Thankfully, we are coming out of the drought a bit here in North Carolina. And there is a drought task force at the state level, and DHHS is leading the health component of that task force. We've been communicating with other state agencies and community partners and drought experts from academia to better understand how the drought is impacting people's health. We're providing environmental public health recommendations based on CDC and other expert guidance we've received, and have leveraged testimonies from partners in the field. And then we continue to work on communication materials and investigating the short and long-term impacts of drought on health in the state, which in some ways is not exactly a direct impact on health, but more of a threat multiplier. It can make a lot of things worse. So I'll stop there and see if you all have any questions on any of those topics.
Thank you, Dr. Guidry, for the newsy update. Also, a lot of risk communication, exposure assessment, and risk reduction work going on at DHHS. David.
Yeah, thank you, Tom. This may be for both Virginia and I see Secretary Sushmore still outside the content of your presentations. Do you all have any, and I'm going to qualify my question with any information because I know enough to be dangerous, but any information, insight, update on the potential impacts of the deepening and widening project from the core of the port for Wilmington and the river channel and the deposition of material on shore, on beaches, that kind of thing. I've heard dermal seafoam analysis revealing high numbers of PFAS, et cetera. But I've also heard the deposition concentration is expected to be much less all the way down here in the lower Cape Fear versus above the lock and dams. But I really don't know. Do you have any awareness of that process as the Corps goes through their approval process? I know there's some pushback. I just didn't know where we stood and what that looks like going forward. Thank you.
I'll defer to Sushma on this topic if she has any information. I don't from the DHHS perspective.
Yeah, David, it's a bit of a long story, but I'll try to condense it and the issues today. So the Wilmington Harbor dredging project consisted of an EIS that was developed by the Army Corps of Engineers. The project is sponsored by the Port Authority under DOT. The EIS contained no information on PFAS, alongside a couple other issues that were related to sea level rise and a few other items, all of which led the Division of DCM Coastal Management to issue a denial of the consent of what we call the consistency determination, whether it was consistent with the Coastal Management Act. That particular denial set into motion additional discussions. The Corps was not happy, but it also basically led to how they can surpass that issue. There have been conversations with them and their headquarters, and we met to address the deficiencies related to PFAS, sea level rise, And then a couple other things there. Secondly, there's a 401 application associated with the dredging. That's also got a few letters of additional information out. So holistically and collectively, we feel like there's more work to be done. We have had detailed conversation on what characterization of that harbor channel needs to be in order to assess the current state of potential PFAS in the sediment and in the water, and how the dredging construction and routine operation will affect the disturbance of that material and potentially ultimate suspension of that material that could be carried into nearby drinking water supplies like your community. And those are the questions. They're not simple answers, but we really feel like that needs to be addressed. And ultimately, when they remove the dredge material, where do they place them? And then there are different options for placing if it is contaminated for where that material goes so that it doesn't affect the environment any further. So it's a huge project, and because it is at the mouth of the Cape Fear River, where we know there's everything we talked about, Virginia and I today, has the potential that we could find it, and we just don't know how much and where. And that assessment is the initial background data collection is important for a project like this.
Thank
And
you.
I would love to actually talk with you all on that part with our teams to get a better sense of what receptors along the coastal areas that could be potentially evaluated for drinking water and other environmental impacts from the offshore activities.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question, David, and for the feedback and the plan to follow up, Sushma. Other questions for Dr. Guidry on DHHS's, on her update for DHHS activities? From infectious to non-infectious disease agents. All right. Well, thanks for the agency updates. That moves us now to the presentation portion of the agenda. The first of which is going to be from Virginia Guidry. And she introduced herself earlier, but for the purposes of the recording, anybody listening in, recall that Dr. Virginia Guidry is the branch head for occupational and environmental epidemiology at DHHS, and also, if I remember right, an adjunct associate professor in the Department of Epidemiology at UNC Chapel Hill. And she's going to be talking to us today about the Great Lakes Consortium Fish Consumption PFAS Advisory's best practices, a relook at fish consumption advisories from the Great Lakes states for PFOS, PFOS, one of the PFAS in particular. And with that introduction, I'll turn it over to Virginia.
Thanks. And I can no longer share my screen. I know we troubleshot that earlier, but maybe it can
Steven's
be updated
on it.
again.
I can do it.
Okay,
You should have
Thanks.
it now.
great. Thank you. Now it's coming up. All right, let's see how this goes.
I can see
Okay.
it.
Full screen, looks all right. Okay, well, so thanks for the opportunity to present today. These guidelines were sent out to the board ahead of the meeting, and we wanted to walk through them today to basically kind of give an overview of what they recommend. And you know, we are considering adopting these guidelines here in North Carolina for PFAS. Fish consumption advisories. And so we really wanted to walk through them today and get any feedback you have. Of course, you're also welcome to provide feedback after the meeting as well. So I'll go ahead and provide the overview, but just wanted you all to know that we are definitely interested to hear your thoughts and expertise on these guidelines. Okay, so first, just a quick reminder. So DHHS issues fish consumption advisories as part of our role on educating people about exposure to harmful substances in the environment when we have the evidence to do so. We all know that fish from contaminated waters can be a source of exposure to environmental toxins, and we have issued fish advisories since about 2002, the first one being for mercury, which is still in place statewide. And currently we have all of our fish consumption advisories in the story map that's listed there with a link, and that's a picture of the landing page there for the story map, and you can walk through all the advisories and look them up by location there. So fish consumption advisories are designed to protect recreational and subsistence fishers when we have evidence of contamination in fish. They, and very importantly, do not create any legal or regulatory restrictions on fishing or fish consumption, and we don't regulate commercial fisheries or fish sold in commerce. Our advisories are developed when we have representative fish tissue samples, but they are typically collected at one point in time and not monitored regularly due to resource constraints. And in the past, our advisories have not accounted for the potential benefits of fish consumption, which has always been a bit of a struggle for us when we have toxicological information, but we do not have a way to account quantitatively for those benefits of fish consumption. So for most of our advisories, we follow US EPA guidance for developing them. However, in September 2025, the Great Lakes Consortium for Fish Consumption Advisories issued this new best practice for PFAS guidelines, which modified the US EPA approach. And just as a quick reminder, PFAS is the PFAS compound that typically occurs in the highest concentrations in fish across the US as well as in North Carolina. And so this new method was of great interest to us, and we wanted to take a closer look at it. So these guidelines were developed by a best practice work group that was reviewing new toxicity values for PFAS, and it involves 7 states. They're listed there, plus Ontario in the work group. Those guidelines reflect updates and input from those consortium members, and the guidelines consider both the risks of PFAS exposure and the health benefits of fish consumption, and I'll walk through how they do so. So first of all, the guidelines agree that the 2024 US EPA PFAS toxicity review was the most up-to-date and comprehensive toxicity information available for PFAS PFOS. And of course, that review was used to establish the maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs, in drinking water. They also questioned the need to account for intrahuman variability when the points of departure for the human equivalent doses were already based on sensitive populations, especially given the potential loss of health benefits associated with reducing fish consumption. And then they also considered the evidence that PFAS in fish tissue was not as bioavailable as it is in water. So first of all, looking at the intrahuman variability considerations, so the effect levels, or the point of departure human equivalent doses that were identified for US EPA for cardiovascular and developmental effects are 1.2 nanograms per kilogram per day and 1.13 nanograms per kilogram per day, respectively, which they rounded to 1 nanogram per kilogram per day. So they argue in the guidelines that a health protection value of 1 nanogram per kilogram per day of PFAS would prevent doses above effect thresholds and pose acceptable risks for cardiovascular and developmental endpoints, and have reasonable margins of exposure when considering other toxicity effect levels. So they believe that the choice of this health protection value provides reasonable protection against toxic effects and also avoids unnecessary loss of fish consumption health benefits. The health protection value that they developed is based on a weight of evidence, assessment, and professional judgment that considers both risks and benefits. And so it could be construed as incorporating risk management considerations, and really it is a risk management decision in this case. So they argue that for all populations, both general and sensitive, they recommend using that 1.0 nanogram per kilogram per day point of departure human equivalent dose as the health protection value for fish consumption guidelines for PFAS. And importantly, this value does not include that intrahuman variability factor of 10 that's used in the EPA reference dose for calculation of the PFAS drinking water MCL. So we're already seeing a little bit of a difference based on that factor of 10. And then also they presented information from several studies about the bioavailability of PFAS. And according to the report's authors, and this is straight from the report, they summarized these studies and basically said that the absorption of PFAS from fish is likely to be much less than that from drinking water. And, the current US EPA approach for fish consumption advisories assumes 100% bioavailability. And so they said that it overestimates the serum levels that are measured here by about 4-fold. And so the resulting modifications from that EPA method take both of those things into account. So when assessing the health protective value, it does not include the intrahuman variability factor of 10 that was previously used for the reference dose from EPA for PFAS. And then it also applies a 0.25 bioavailability factor for fish consumption guidelines rather than 1 based on the current literature. So those two things together result in a 40 times higher meal limit calculation compared to standard US EPA method. These are just some quotes from the report about this and their rationale. And they're just noting, in the first point there that eliminating local fish consumption due to implementation of, strict guidelines using the US EPA reference dose removes an important low-cost source of protein and other nutrients for many people, which could result in adverse impacts on public health. They argue that this rationale considers both the risks of PFAS exposure and the health benefits. They also acknowledge that scientific understanding of adverse health effects and risk assessment of PFAS is continually evolving and should be actively monitored. And then they also acknowledge that the human-based reference dose is appropriate for many applications, including drinking water guidelines. However, its appropriateness for fish consumption advice should be considered and may be more limited. And then this is basically, again, this is straight from their report based on measurements in fish fillets, what they would recommend for meal frequencies. And again, this would be about 40 times higher than what we have recommended previously for PFAS. And of course, we're considering right now for additional fish consumption advisories for the lowest part of the Cape Fear. And so in summary, we just want to acknowledge that setting fish advisories is a balance, and that lower meal recommendations also limit the health benefits of eating fish, while higher meal recommendations can allow for more PFAS ingestion than advisable to prevent health concerns. So we're really trying to find that balance here. These guidelines do use the most up-to-date toxicity information available. They do acknowledge that eating fish can also provide nutrients that protect against some of the negative health effects of PFAS and other contaminants on, developmental and potentially cardiovascular impacts. And so they considered that in their guidelines. And then just noting that they have been adopted wholly or in part by New York, Wisconsin, and Michigan. And as mentioned at the start, we're continuing to consider in North Carolina the adoption of these guidelines for our PFAS fish consumption guidelines. So with that, I will pause and see what questions you all have. Oh, let me add one more point. We have been reviewing these guidelines with a number of partners, including academic partners from Duke and UNC and NC State, who are working on fish consumption advisories, and community partners that are working with them as well, to just kind of run through the same information and this approach and collect feedback along the way. And of course, we've also reviewed these previously with our partners at DEQ. So just want to mention that as well. So I'll see if there's any questions.
Well, thank you, Dr. Guidry. I've read this report cover to cover. You did a good job of summarizing where the major differences come in for the factor of 40. The not using a human health uncertainty factor of 10 for sensitive populations because the developmental toxicity studies were done epidemiologically based on children, which they deemed to be the sensitive population. And the epidemiology studies on cardiovascular effects were done on older adults, which were deemed to be the most sensitive population there. And then the bioavailability information for a factor of 0.25 for bioavailability via fish versus water. I just had a couple of clarifying questions before I ask people if they have other questions. Well, let's start with other questions for Dr. Guidry based on the presentation first, and then we can get into a discussion about the guidelines themselves. So any questions for Dr. Guidry versus on the presentation or what the guidelines say or proposed DHHS direction? And it might help if you, for now, don't share the screen. We might have to refer to it later, but we can see each other a little bit bigger if we don't. I can see hands. Jamie, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. So I shared.
I can't hear you. You just got real faint.
Better?
A little. Try it again.
Sometimes WebEx just does not work well.
It's really faint, but I think I can hear you.
Yeah, we can hear you. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I did review this document originally, comment partners, but I'm just curious from your perspective and based on your presentation, this particular document is not peer reviewed. It's put together by this informal group who really have no authority. So I'm just wondering about DHHS's concerns with the lack of external peer review.
Okay, you did cut in and out a little bit, but I'm pretty sure I caught the gist of the question, which was about, concern for lack of external peer review. I think that's a great point. And that's one of the reasons that we've been, presenting this to a number of partners to collect feedback and, hoping for feedback from the Secretary Science Advisory Board as well. So yes, true, and that's one of the reasons we've been asking for feedback on the approach. We do like that it's trying to take a little bit more maybe of a risk management approach and weighing the benefits and the potential harms as well. So.
Thanks, Jamie. And before I get to Detlef, let me just ask maybe something that'll help clarify or focus the discussion. When you say that DHHS is socializing it, getting others to review it, thinking about the merits of adopting it, would it only be for PFAS, or would it be this methodology in general for other fish consumption advisories? Because when you mentioned in the first or second slide, the different guidance that's available, EPA guidance versus this. DHHS, of course, has their own internal guidance. In 2018 is the most recent version that I saw for developing consumption advisories. So you could get into whether this would be an amendment to that, require an amendment to that, or whether this is only focused on PFAS and the approach wouldn't be necessarily the new approach for all other PFAS chemicals or other chemicals. What is it that DHHS is considering adopted, and how does it relate to existing state FCA guidance? And then we'll get to Detlef.
Yeah, thanks for that question, Tom. We are considering applying it only to PFAS, PFOS. It has a fairly limited scope, and the rationale is pretty specific as well. So we're not considering changing our other, our approach to other contaminants in fish at this time.
Great. I think that helps a little bit, because it does kind of look at only one side of uncertainty for one chemical. And if it became part of an SOP, just regardless of how it turned out, looking at both sides of uncertainty and how that could shove a number lower or higher for complete mistake could be helpful. And maybe that's part of the path forward here. But I understand now that it would be adoption of this approach for one chemical, as opposed to a new SOP for how to do FCAs and NC. Detlef.
Yeah, thank you for the summary, Virginia. I also looked at this report, and one thing that I was curious about was the 25% estimate for the bioavailability. I thought the data in the report, if I remember right, actually showed somewhat higher bioavailability than the 25% value. I think in the 40% range, maybe. So do you know why they ended up with 25%, and yeah, how is that justified?
I can't speak to their, how they arrived at that, but I would be happy for our team to take a closer look at the papers that were behind their recommendation, and maybe follow up with you about it too, Detlef, and just kind of look at their interpretation of those papers that they cite. So I appreciate that.
That portion of the document talks a little bit about toxicokinetics of the compounds as well. So that could be something that Elena could help out with. The report itself doesn't have a lot of numbers other than the summary tables for what's concluded from this basically an uncertainty analysis and reassessment. But there are links in there toward other calculations and other reports that were done. So it could require a little bit of a deeper dive there to get into that. But I was thinking the same thing in terms of that being one of the two drivers. Other questions for Dr. Guidry or comments on their request to the board for feedback? Dr. Starr, and then we'll get to Jamie.
Yeah, just a quick question about the health benefits of fish consumption. There was reference to that being a consideration, and it's not reflected in either of the two factors that you talked about in any specific quantitative way. I wonder if those numbers would have changed in any way if fish had no health benefit, fish consumption. And was there any discussion of how much fish consumption benefit was factored in, and how? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Starr. I appreciate that question. I do think it's a little bit nebulous in the report. They are arguing for an approach that does in some way take health benefits into account. It's not exactly direct quantification of health benefits. However, it would be great if there were a way to do that. And instead, my interpretation is that basically they're arguing for a different interpretation of the application of the reference dose and the fish consumption advisory guidelines as a way to account for health benefits, because otherwise they're not accounted for at all. So that's my interpretation of it. but I certainly understand your question on that.
Thank you.
To Tom's point, before we get to Jamie, there was some other things in there that didn't end up being quantified, but were referenced so similarly as a reason for the decision. They mentioned that multiple co-occurring PFAS may have contributed to the cholesterol impacts and the low birth weight impacts of PFOS, that it would be hard to distinguish PFOS, PFOS from co-occurring PFAS. But there wasn't a way to tease that out. It was just mentioned as another rationale for why the EPA number in these authors' phrasing may be overly conservative. And then also relative source contribution, they didn't add that in. And they also mentioned that the linear dose response curves, may not be linear. They may be a different shape at the low end of the dose response curve. Didn't say what they would be or what the effect of that would be, but just that could be another qualitative reason for these being overly conservative. So let's move on to Jamie.
Hopefully my sound's a little bit better now, is it?
It goes high and low, but right now it's good.
Okay. So since we're kind of moving over,
It went away. We're missing it. If we made you a presenter, would it work? Do you think?
All right, how is this? I'm using my laptop. Is that better?
That's much better.
Okay. Some programs just don't work well with my webcam. So I did, I think the community members with whom I worked did submit some of my official comments, or not official, but comments I had on the consortium document itself. And I think, Tom, you raised some very important points. I think that this document was extremely critical of the US EPA approach, which is a peer-reviewed approach, right? The US EPA reference doses were derived after rigorous internal review, rigorous external review by the PFAS Science Advisory Board, including rigorous review from the public. This consortium document is very critical of the EPA approach, even though the approach was, as I said, rigorously peer-reviewed at different levels. And then the consortium provided information on the benefits of fish consumption, which Tom already indicated, was very qualitative. And certainly fish consumption is important for public health. But I think that the mistake that the DHHS might make in accepting these guidelines is that you are accepting a document that is less rigorous than the US EPA recommendations. And I think an important consideration about fish consumption guidelines is that they're just that, right? They're guidelines that give people choices so that they can make decisions about whether or not they're going to take the risk of the contaminant in the food with the understanding that the benefits might outweigh the risks. But by raising the guidelines with the document, with the support of this document, I think is a mistake because it does not have the level of rigorous peer review. When I asked about peer review, the response was, the document was reviewed internally by consortium members. So the people who wrote the document reviewed it. So I just want DHS to consider that this document is not as rigorous as the EPA document that they thoroughly criticize. And I don't understand why they criticized a document that is rigorous.
Thanks, Jamie.
A couple other things to think about if you're just looking for general feedback upon reading it. This is me, not a board statement. I think it's good that they didn't reinvent the 2024 synthesis of the science and use the EPA document as a jumping off point. That is a recent robust review. So use that as a starting point, I think is good. In addition to the bioavailability factor, which is one of the drivers that Detlef mentioned as the thing, place to take a deeper dive into the papers that are referenced, like you mentioned, or the analysis that might be in some of the links in the report. The other one is the not using a factor of 10 uncertainty factor for sensitive human populations. And it's not my area of expertise, so I'm not going to say how to do it, but I think it would be worth in your discussions with people for whom it is their expertise to find out, is it really only young that makes for a sensitive human population in PFAS exposure for developmental effects? And is it really only old that makes you a sensitive population for PFAS, cardiovascular effects? If there's nothing else about human physiology that's important, or it's understood that those are the drivers, then that would be a good rationale for either taking away the factor of 10 or reducing it from 10 to some other number between 0 and 10. I don't know the answer to that, but my sense is that there may be in the robust toxicological literature for a compound like PFAS, something else that could make a population sensitive that we either know or we don't know, and are providing that margin of safety. So that'd be an area maybe to dig into, similar to the bioavailability, where it's a driver, it's something to look at. And then something more general might be just whether or not there's anything in the state's fish consumption advisory approach now that presents a range that suggests presenting a range of risks as opposed to certain numbers, which would give you the latitude to look at range of risks. And then I guess my last general comment, because again, it's not my area of expertise, as I read it, I think it would be more compelling if it included a section on, for all those data tables and endpoints, is there any place where a lower number would have been justified with a different safety factor, adjustment factor, a different way of looking at the data, a different slope? Just even if it turns out that the answer is nope, 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 we found out that it was extremely conservative, the conclusion was overly conservative, but at least it would have been a section there to take a dive into both sides of uncertainty to explain to the public. In critiquing the EPA approach, we looked for how you could have driven a number lower or how a number could be justified as higher based on the science. I do think there's science behind both of those points, the uncertainty factor and the bioavailability factor to dig into. But just for completeness sake, looking for all the different aspects of uncertainty rather than just these couple would make for maybe a more compelling read and a better answer to the public that might ask, why adopting one consortium's review as opposed to we use the consortium report as one piece of information when we jumped into this. And our analysis looked at both sides of the uncertainty that could have been applied for every parameter. So no question there, I don't think, just some things to think about in terms of how it struck me. I don't know who was first, but I'm going to go with Elena because we haven't heard Elena first in a while.
Okay, there were several things about the document that did concern me. Being a quantitative person, the big thing was that it was very hard there was qualitative rationale that actually was pretty well written, but I can't replicate their calculations that got them there. Particularly the bioavailability was what I looked at. I think Tom's point about could one reasonably consider factors for human individual variability. I think that's not really addressed that I could find, and I think that's an important question to look at. Basically, the lack of quantitation and the methodology wasn't explicit enough for me to be comfortable with just saying, oh, this is a good idea. Now, that being said, I do commend them for trying to consider the benefits, because I think all too often, especially for people who are living more of a subsistence, local produce, local fish type life, I think these things tend to get forgotten. And so I think the fact that they're trying to do it is moving that whole area forward, because they're trying to consider benefits. You have to start somewhere. Calculation of benefits is really an emerging science that's very data intensive, and I don't think is a well-developed or mature science as yet, relative to some other things like, say, toxicokinetics and bioavailability estimation. So I don't want to see that. I don't want that point lost. That being said, the methodology does need to be more explicit. I need to be able to see how they got to where they got to. And I would like to know more about what kind, what I've heard here is, and in looking at the document, it looks like there was no external peer review from what I can tell. So if it was looked at internally, who looked at it? Those are all things I would kind of want to know, but particularly explicit consideration of quantitative consideration of how they got to the number they got to is really notable in its absence. And I have a level of discomfort with this because that's not really there.
Thank you, Elena. I had suggested to find out, whether or not there are presentations, technical reports behind this that would
Yeah.
provide the math.
That would be excellent.
And there probably are. I haven't clicked all of the links in the document to follow it because I was just looking at it yesterday.
Yeah, I
But
didn't either.
that's the typical place that you might find some of that, since it's not in the body of the document, which is, it was nice that they kept it concise to be able to focus in on it. Detlef.
Yeah, I have a maybe slightly broader question. Virginia, is it correct that the fish advisory currently only applies to the section of the Cape Fear below Camors? And the reason why I'm asking is that some of the highest PFOS concentrations in the watershed are really in the Haw River. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are on the geographic applicability of the fish advisory.
Yeah, that's a good question. So our fish advisories are, typically reliant on where the fish samples come from. And, we can make advisories when we have representative samples from, certain geographic areas of water bodies. And so, yes, at the moment, because we only have samples from roughly Camors down, that's where the advisories will apply. We have, kind of considered how we do this, and, are there ways to expand those advisories? But at the moment, we're sticking with the approach of providing advisories for the areas where we have the required fish samples, and we can actually calculate the advisories. So that's, but I hear you on that. And I think we are open to potentially developing additional fish advisories if we have additional fish data to use that, follows the protocol.
I guess Amy Dolinsky back in 2007 or 8 published a paper with fish levels in the Haw River also. So there are some data available, although they're a bit dated now.
Mm-hmm.
Although the PFOS levels in the hall haven't really changed all that much over the years. Yeah, just curious.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Detlef, and we can take another look at that, but I'm aware of the paper that you're talking about, and so I am guessing that for some reason it wasn't quite sufficient for the fish advisory protocol, but we can go back and look at that again, and I know that's a concern that we share as well, that they're pretty limited in geographic nature.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Virginia.
John?
Thanks, Virginia, for the overview. I guess what I'm hearing is sort of process questions as well as science questions. But I guess the question to you is this a take it or leave it proposition that you accept this report as the basis for fish advisories in the Lower Cape Fear or not? Or do you say what the state can do is option 1, 2, 3. Option 1 is accept this as is. Option 2 is consider taking it or something like it to peer review. Option 3 is recalculate things and take that to peer. What do you see as the options in your position?
You know, it's a good question. I mean, I think our preference, given our limited staff, et cetera, is to try to adopt an existing methodology in some format, you know, but we do want to be able to stand behind that methodology and, you know, lean on it and use it as the rationale for what advisories we're issuing. So I guess what I would say is, you know, that's really what I would say is our primary choice right now is which existing methodology to use. I don't think we have to totally be limited. We could consider other options, but at the moment, you know, typically we would rather use an existing methodology.
Okay. You know, I guess a question to this group is, do you want us to peer review it? You know, I mean, that would be, I think the peer review point is an important one. Because there's always a question about development. It's people reviewing their own materials versus someone independent from that looking at it. I don't know if that's an option that you would consider, or in the absence of anything, where are we now? Is there any fish advisory that you see as appropriate, or are we in a big gap here? Where are we right now?
I mean, I guess maybe we can follow up on the question about whether the SAB would be asked to peer review. I think it's really helpful to hear all of the feedback today, and, you know, so we can consider that question. So thank you for that. You know, as far as the other question about the gap, I mean, there are many gaps when it comes to fish advisories, but, you know, I think in summary, you know, we're limited by the fish data that we have, and we're limited by the methodologies that are available. And so we're trying to use, you know, what we have when we have it, to establish those advisories.
It's a little funny for this group to be the peer reviewers because it's not your document. You know? So then what do you do with the comments? Do you change that and make a new document? And then this is the state of North Carolina document, which may not be the same. As it's a funny kind of odd situation, I would say. So I don't necessarily want to commit to that, but it's worth talking through what process would be the best for the state. What I'm hearing you is taking on an existing document is the best due to resources and timing and all of that. But again, you've heard the cautions here, and maybe what's curious to me is that the state of New York and Michigan and Wisconsin accepted this.
Well, and I would say the important caveat there is wholly or in part. So it's I wouldn't say that it's 100% implemented.
Okay, because I would have had expected that they would have had some similar debates there in each of those states, but I don't know their process. Thank you.
You raise a good point, John, about process versus science questions. And I was going back and forth in mine, you know, in terms of what guidance does the state have? Is there a way to propose a range of risks rather than have to have a single point of departure leading to a reference dose as opposed to a range of reasonable values, things like that. And then the science questions, and the science questions seemed like they focused on the two that were drivers, the use of the human health factor, assuming that there was no need for any adjustment because sensitive populations had been addressed, and they were epidemiological studies. And then the other one, which was the bioavailability factor adjustment of 0.25. One more science thing to think about, I guess, if you dig into it further. Well, first on the process part, it would be good to find out what was the extended peer review. Maybe there was more than we don't know about that's happened since. Maybe it's been submitted for publication somewhere in a risk management journal. Maybe there were staff scientists that were involved in doing it beyond the original authors so that it was reviewed internally, but not necessarily by the authors. It'd be good to find out before we dig into it, in large part because it's not our document and not final. The only other science question that I have when I look at my list, following up on John's, I think, helpful framework about process versus science, is in the table that lists the epidemiological endpoints that were available and highlights the point of departure of 1 to which you could or could not apply the factor of 10. There are several other endpoints in that table of points of departure which are nearly identical. And so if there's multiple studies that could have gotten you to a similar endpoint, focusing in only on one and why you wouldn't use the factor of 10, to me is helpful, but it might not be the whole story, because perhaps if you had taken another one that's there as one, so just to make it less obtuse, we're talking about table 4, and the Wickstrom value is the one that was used by EPA. I take it the 1.13 that led to a 0.1. But if you look a couple lines up, there's a 1.0, a 1.83, a 1.78. If you scroll down in the table, there's a 1.2, a 1.22 that have, in some cases, similar, or in some cases, different effects. It's not my area of expertise, but with multiple points of departure to choose from, critiquing the uncertainty factor applied to just one of them, to me, is a partial story, but maybe not the complete story if you're going to try to justify a new approach. Does that make sense?
Are you saying
Yes.
that, maybe for some of the values, they weren't necessarily derived for the most sensitive population?
Well, there's the chance of that, right? I would think you'd have to.
There is, yeah.
I would be more convinced if somebody took this methodology and ran it through all of the data that you have to see how it shakes out again, as opposed to critiquing one endpoint and saying that you wouldn't necessarily have had to apply this human health safety factor. A 10 versus a 0 versus a 3, could be argued about. And then in addition to that, we don't know that this compound is bioavailable by fish. That part might not change with the studies. But if you're going to start from picking one point of departure that's the same order of magnitude as a half a dozen others in there, it would seem like it would be more convincing to me to follow the analysis through about, well, what would you have concluded in terms of whether or not any additional safety factors were applied before you got to the reference dose? Because otherwise it seems like it could just shift them, that this one becomes a 40 instead of a 0.1. But the other ones might have shifted as well. I'm not saying it has to be done that way, but just that in singling out a critique of one study, there was a lot of other things in table 4 and table 3 that showed effects the same order of magnitude as this. So it would just be one more science thing to dig into a little bit, to see if the similar approach applied to other endpoints would hold together or not, or whether or not, no, actually those would end up right where we were.
Yeah.
Especially for things that were different than cardiovascular and developmental, like immune, because then you'd have to pull in a different line of argument about whether or not there were any sensitive populations affected for immune issues or not. Others, either with questions for Dr. Guidry or with feedback on the report, I'll call it early feedback, since we just got the report recently, and also I just heard the presentation today. Anyone that we haven't heard from who's been trying to get in, now's your chance.
I think you made a really good point, Tom. I think one thing that isn't clear to me is whether for all of the different endpoints, they were derived for the most sensitive population, right? The one that they chose was, but maybe there was another one that has either a very similar value, but maybe it did not account for the sensitive population criterion. So that's something that also should be looked at carefully.
I have just a question about the EPA number, which we would, I guess, say was 1 instead of the 40 times higher number. Did that involve a 10-fold safety factor for the most sensitive population or not? Was it for just an ordinary middle of the line person, or was it applied and assumed to represent the potential risk for sensitive subpopulations? That, does the one have a built-in 10 in it in the EPA document?
My understanding is that for the EPA reference dose, the uncertainty factor of 10 was used.
But that's how it got to a 0.1 from a 1.
Mm-hmm.
And to Tom's point, the report, I don't think, says anything more than that wouldn't necessarily be justified because the epidemiological study that was used was looking at children birth weight, and that is the most sensitive population. That's the extent to which they discussed it. They didn't go in to say, which was my first point that I might not have said very well. It'd be worth examining whether or not there's anything else relative to PFAS exposure to people. Is there any other sensitive subpopulation besides being young for developmental effects and old for cardiovascular effects? And I suppose to Tom's point, digging into what EPA's rationale was for the use of it, because they would have had access to the same line of thought as used in the report. So that could be healthy. Find out why they said 10 instead of 3 or 0. Or satisfy yourself that that's the right answer based on what we understand about what sensitive subpopulations could be or might not be. My point was just that if you look at the last column of table 4, although one study is critiqued to change the number to justify a higher number, and I'm not saying it's incorrect, there's other values in the last column of table 4 that are just as low, that aren't the subject of any discussion in the report. Other feedback or questions? We're doing good on time.
Well, I just want to say I really appreciate the discussion today and the ability to, hear some feedback and talk about it a bit. So thanks to everyone who's reviewed it and provided feedback to us.
Well, you're quite welcome, and thanks for teeing it up so nicely with a link to the report that Franny sent out early, and then also your overview of it today, which did seem to hit the highlights. On process issues on path forwards, you've gotten feedback today. The report hasn't been available for a long time to board members. What's y'all's pleasure at DHHS for how we move forward with this? Is this adequate that it's been teed up and you've got feedback to consider and you'll come back if you want something more formal? Or would you like anything more formal, or where do you want to go from here?
Well, we've gotten a lot of feedback today, and I have been taking notes. Of course, it's recorded as well. So I appreciate all of that. Maybe Tom, just to give board members a little bit of additional time to review, if there's additional comments, I'll look to your leadership on this, but, maybe if you could send them in a week or 2 weeks or something like that. And then we'll, be circling up on our end. Maybe a week is good, just, while it's fresh and everything. I know that everyone's got a lot going on, so it's gonna get bumped off the plate by everything else pretty soon. So, but I'm open to what you suggest.
If you don't need to have a consensus statement from the board, then I do think we could leave it open for a couple of weeks. I'm going to say to get them done earlier if you can, to provide comments directly to Dr. Guidry and Dr. Moore and Dr. Nielsen too, for completeness sake. And if you want to copy me on them, that's fine. And then once y'all get the benefit of the advice that you were given today in terms of digging into some of the data to see what else is available, and any further feedback, then you can always come back and ask additional questions or ask for something more formal. But it does seem like there's a lot of, there's enough open-ended advice for things to go look at and check on to keep folks busy for a while. So how about we say 2 weeks for anybody else to provide comments? If you do so, address them to Dr. Guidry, Dr. Moore, Dr. Nilsson, and me. And then we'll wait on any next steps for us until we hear back from DHHS on what might be helpful.
Sounds good.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for your work on that. We are probably running just about 15 minutes early, but I think that's fine. We'll break for lunch. I don't have the agenda right in front of me. Franny, do you remember what we had said? Was it an hour?
I did put an hour for lunch.
And do we want to just keep to that hour? Do we want to regroup at 1 as opposed to like 12:45? Since the agenda was posted that way, it would only be like an extra 12 minutes, but it might help us not get too far in advance of our schedule given Kennedy Holt's availability later. Is that okay with folks? We group at 1 like we had planned. I'm aware that some of you might need to leave.
I think that sounds good.
Then we will adjourn until 1 o'clock. If Stephen could put on the chat or anything that's public facing that we're adjourned until 1, that would be helpful. And I'll remind all of you that if you step away from your computer, either mute, camera off, because the public can probably still see it while you're having lunch, or just log back out and log back in.
Okay.
Any questions before we break?
So I think you just answered it. We're staying live here. I don't need to log out because I did have trouble getting in. So let's
I
just leave
don't
it
think
as
you would
is.
need to log out. The recording will stay on if that's okay with Stephen.
Tom, I'm happy to pause the recording while we're away for lunch.
That sounds even better. But all the members can just turn their cameras off and stay connected, correct?
Oh, that is correct, yes.
All right. Thanks. We'll see everybody at 1. Thank you. And welcome back, everybody. Thanks for rejoining for the second half of the meeting today and 2 presentations on topics that we've had some visitation with before. Before I turn it over to Franny for the first topic, I just wanted to revisit the last one just for a second. It struck me over lunch that we, at these meetings, are sometimes talking to multiple audiences, and although the feedback was for DHHS in particular last time, the meetings are recorded so other people can listen later. I just wanted to point out, that a lack of peer review doesn't mean that the work is wrong. It means that it hasn't yet been, and it may have been, but even if it hadn't been, it just would mean that it hadn't yet been independently checked by other experts. And it wouldn't invalidate the work. It just means that there's been less opportunity to identify any errors. But importantly, it also misses the opportunity to strengthen an argument. It can go both ways in peer reviews. Your text can get tighter, your rationale can get more robust, or somebody could find something that maybe you had a blind spot on in your own work. So it doesn't invalidate it, made it wrong. It's just a well-founded scientific step for best practices. With that addition to the last section, for anybody who's still interested in that topic, we'll move on to the first presentation of this afternoon, which is going to be by Franny Nielsen, Dr. Franny Nielsen, who's an environmental toxicologist in the Secretary's Office of DEQ. Also our board liaison, now in your 6th year, I think, with DEQ. Is that right?
Yeah, it is. Time flies. We're aging rapidly.
And you may go through all this, but I'll just set the stage a little bit on the topic. I don't know the content of Franny's presentation, but the board has been around PFMOAA a couple of times. It came to the board as a charge in 2022 to review 2 studies for their adequacy and appropriateness in deriving a reference dose or a health-based protective value. And in 2023, the board concluded its work on that after a series of meetings and recommended that DEQ pause derivation of a reference dose until some other published work was coming, noting at the time too that there was inadequate data with which to derive a reference dose from those 2 studies. So pause because data was inadequate and some more was coming. Early in 2024, EPA published a mammalian toxicity study for which Dr. Justin Conley was the lead author. And in August 2024, Justin Conley addressed the Science Advisory Board, gave us an overview of their results. We have heard from Franny a few times on the status of the Keymore consent order studies for which PFMOAA mammalian toxicity tests have been and will continue to be conducted. There's both mice and rat studies for immunotoxicological endpoints over a 28-day exposure and other endpoints over a 90-day exposure. I think the last update we had was that the immunotox studies for rats and mice were complete or in data analysis, and that the 90-day studies were coming. When the board concluded in 2023 that information was inadequate, we also recommended, though, that DEQ continue to refresh its literature searches on the topic and work toward doing the math that would be needed to derive a reference dose from anything that was available to be helpful. So that's where we've been. We had a charge that we completed. Part of that charge was to pause until more data were available. More data are available. There hasn't been a new charge to the board yet. And that brings us to Franny's presentation on the status of PFMOAA.
Great. Thanks for that, Tom. That actually saves me several slides. So thanks everyone for attending today. We have been, back and forth with the PFMOAA reference dose derivation for a while now. And there are a few things that I wanted to just bring up and share with you ahead of any new requests we might make. And so I'm going to go through a little bit of history and then kind of share some of the current status bits with you. Okay, so as far as the history goes, in 2022, we had a lot of meetings about this particular compound. The June meeting in 2022 was where we posed this charge to the board, and it was two parts: to review the two studies that were available in detail and determine if these were sufficient to determine a point of departure for a reference dose at that time. There were 3 subsequent meetings where a lot of discussion occurred. That was in August, October, and December of 2022. The links to those recordings and the timestamps are here just for anyone that is interested. But after all of the discussion, the board's response, which this is abridged and paraphrased, is that these studies are of high quality, but had different limitations that precluded their use from being used for a point of departure and a reference dose derivation. At this time, the board recommended we paused this process until we had some more publications that were available for review, and that we periodically refresh our literature review for other relevant papers to determine what could be included here. And so this was the first meeting of 2023 where this recommendation was discussed, and then the formal recommendation was finalized in March of 2023. And I don't have the link for that in this presentation, but I will put it in the minutes when I put all of this together later. Just as Tom said, that Dr. Conley published a paper in mid-2024 and then came to give a presentation in the Archdale room in August of that year, which highlighted the maternal oral exposure of PFMOAA in this rat model that has been used for PFAS research at EPA throughout recent history. After this meeting, we met again in December of 2024, and we posed this question again to the board, that now with Justin's paper, is there enough scientific support to determine this point of departure and use the point of departure for a reference dose for PFMOAA? Between that meeting and the next meeting we had, which was April of 2025, there were some things happening in the background. And so in 2022, when we posed this issue and this item and charge to the board, we had also submitted PFMOAA as a nominated priority compound for the EPA to review for a toxicity assessment. And we didn't hear anything about it for a long time, and that's normal. We just submitted it for consideration. And then shortly after the December meeting in January of 2025, we received notice from the EPA Office of Research and Development that this toxicity assessment of PFMOAA was formally in the review process with the goal of deriving a reference dose. As of mid-March of 2025, we were told by EPA that the internal review of the literature was done and there was a draft assessment completed, and the next step was to send this draft to external review. All of that happened between the December 24 meeting and the April 25 meeting. At the April 2025 meeting, we presented nearly this identical slide to the board, and then based on the information we'd gotten from EPA, we rescinded or paused the previous charge to the board about reviewing and determining if a reference dose could be created using the 2 previous references as well as Dr. Conley's paper, because we knew that EPA's ORD toxicity assessment was imminent, and we didn't want to utilize the board unnecessarily if there was going to be a federal value presented. And so we paused that. Some things have happened since then, and that's really the update I'm going to share today. So in January of 2025, we received notice that this was in process, the formal review was happening, or previous to that. In March of 25, I went through some of this already. The EPA's internal review was complete and it was moving forward to the next steps to external review. In April, we rescinded the charge to the board and we're waiting for EPA's assessment to be released. In August of 2025, we requested the assessment again, and EPA confirmed that the external review was finished. The PFMOA toxicity assessment was just awaiting approval to be released, and that should just say released, not re-released. In August of that same month, 2025, in correspondence with the EPA, DEQ provided some additional rationale to EPA regarding the importance of PFMOA in North Carolina and how valuable this toxicity assessment would be to us and the people of North Carolina, and just to urge them to release it as soon as it was approved. That takes us to March of 26, so earlier this year. We were in correspondence with EPA again at the beginning of the year, and they confirmed that this assessment was complete and could be released to DEQ. In July, just last month, we requested the final assessment again, and if the final assessment could not be released or wasn't approved for release, we requested that the EPA provide the related support documents. So the weight of evidence analysis, the critical effect worksheets, the background work that had already been done to derive a reference dose to support derivation of a reference dose here, since the work has been done. But that takes us to where we are currently. We have made a few different requests to EPA recently, and have not heard back about this assessment. And so, based on the importance of this compound, we want to bring it back to the board. And so I updated our literature review, which I hadn't done in a few months. But there are a number of new publications. And so I just updated this the other day. And since April 2024, there are 4 new publications that deal specifically with PFMOA. 2 of them are animal models. So there's a zebrafish model and the nematode model, the C. elegans. And then there's also an in vitro cell-based bioassay paper. And so those are, of different value for human health derivation. But this other reference for Killis et al., they derive a provisional chronic oral toxicity value for these short chain PFAS congeners, which PFMOA is included. And so there is, at least one additional paper that I think could be useful in this process. But there are some new papers to review and take into consideration when we're looking at the literature base for this question. And so this is the charge that we presented to the board previously that I've revised a little bit to reflect the current state. And so it's really just, rather than list the 3 individual papers, it's just, with these current studies, is there enough scientific support to identify a point of departure for deriving a reference dose for PFMOA? And so this is the charge that I would consider and ask you to. But my next few questions, I think, are where we can have this discussion. And so I know this is a time-consuming and rigorous ask of the board. And I don't take that lightly. I value your time and your expertise. And so really what I want to know is if the board has the ability and bandwidth to do this. And it would be reviewing this new literature, and then if deemed appropriate, would we have the ability and bandwidth to form a subgroup or a focus team to work through EPA's benchmark dose modeling software and see if a reference dose can be derived? And this is really where I'm curious to hear what your thoughts are, if you have any guidance other than going through the board and through all of you. There is also a state-based group that was started in ECOS, but there's a number of states that are getting together to work through some of the new approach methodologies and the toxicity work that EPA had started under a previous administration, and a lot of that work has been moved outside of EPA. And so the states are trying to revisit it and restart that. And so I have the first meeting with that group in about a week and a half. And so I don't know exactly what the capabilities of that work group are, but that could also be an avenue for perhaps supporting this work or having an additional review outside of this board done or considered. So this is all I have, and I'm very interested to hear anyone's thoughts about it. I'm happy to pull up some of the previous presentations if that's of interest, but I'm just happy to listen to thoughts and considerations. And Sushma, if you have anything to add, please feel free.
All good, Franny. Thank you.
All right. It's pretty clear to me. Maybe just a couple of questions before I open it up for other questions for you. What is the status of the consent order studies, which would be additional mammalian toxicity information for that compound when it's not robust, meaning there's one robust study, but it's just one?
That's a great question. And so last time I presented, the immunological rodent tox tests were underway or in review and report write-up. Those have begun to be submitted and reviewed by DEQ. And so I haven't reviewed all of them yet, and it's underway. But that was another item that I wanted to bring up with the board, perhaps at the December meeting, to see if there was any interest in forming a team or a group to look through those studies and evaluate them in a rigorous fashion.
So the ones that are available to review would be the 28-day oral immunotox for rats and another one for mice?
Yes.
And they're both available now?
Yes, so they have been submitted, and they're over 1,000 pages each, so I haven't finished reviewing them all yet. It's underway, and I am certainly interested in the board's opinion of those studies when I get through the initial checks on the validation of the experiments and all of that. So I've received them, but I've not really completed any review yet.
And then the 90-day tests, they haven't been started, right? Because those will be based in part on results from the 28-day tests.
Yes, and so that is one of the items that I wanted to broach with the board and at the next meeting, or perhaps in an interim meeting, because there's a series of meetings that'll happen with Chemours and Charles River Labs to determine the appropriate doses for those experiments based on the 28-day experiments. And in previous iterations of these protocols, and before they were approved, I met with different mammalian tox researchers, some on the board and some externally at different universities and different agencies. And so I would love to have a more cohesive team to review them if possible, but I'm reluctant to add an additional charge or ask to this right now. So
I got you.
Yeah, we can revisit that. Yeah.
And I'll open it up in just a second, but I'll remind people that the Conley paper has been circulated. The presentation that Justin gave the board is available on our website. I think all of his slides are also available on an EPA website. But that was an oral gavage study of a rodent with doses that were from 10 milligrams per kilogram per day, I think up to 450. And there was no effect level for some of the endpoints, meaning there were effects at the lowest dose, which was 10, and they included increased maternal liver weight, decreased neonatal body weight, some histological evidence of delayed maturation, but there wasn't a no effect level between 10 and 0. So that's one limitation there, not insurmountable, but just reminding you of what's available. But it's published. It was in ES&T. So you have a peer-reviewed NTP type mammalian study that's been available since late 2024. What questions do people have for the board? And we will get back to revisiting these 2 questions as well as the charge, but let's ask questions of Franny or Shushma first to make sure that folks understand what's being asked or anything that would help you consider their requests.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. So, Franny, of course, there were tremendous changes at EPA over the time course of this. So much of the Office of Research and Development staff, and certainly I think all the senior staff, have been reassigned, retired, whatever. So who are you contacting here to provide responses regarding the status of their document, which is done? And where is it? Do you know? Who has that?
So the person that I was contacting is not the person that did the work, but was the person that was assigned it after the new administration came in. And she, confirmed that it was finished and that, she asked for additional support from North Carolina to, submit with the approval request. But she is in the Office of Water and she was shepherding it. I have not heard back from her since March when I emailed her. And then Sushma was connecting with the Region 4, I think the assistant administrator, and some of our other contacts in Region 4 that also confirmed that this was done. I was connecting with Beth Owens, who is in the Office of Water, but I don't know who exactly Sushma had spoken to, but we were, pursuing opposite avenues to try to figure out where it landed.
Okay, I know Beth very well, so I just didn't know whose table it was on. She's was a branch chief. I'm not sure what her position is right now. So, but she's just not able to respond to give it to you. They said they could release it, but they have not released it. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so she's got to get her management to agree, and that's the problem, probably. Okay.
So John, we recognize that this administrative changes and reorganization may have caused folks to shift and may need additional time to get management approvals.
Right.
We did elevate it internally here at DEQ and reached out to our counterparts in Region 4 as well as headquarters.
Good.
I think the positive news we received was, yes, we would get those results, but it just hasn't materialized. And I reached out again to the leadership 2 weeks ago with a status update. And this time we actually said, if you're not able to release the final assessment, then we're open to, as Franny said, the underlying data and or modeling output so that this board could basically carry it to the endpoint for us to have some information for as a decision support tool. It's quite possible we'll get it next week or next month or next year. It's really, we're in a wait and see mode. We've done as much as we can to elevate it, and they understand that there is a need for this. And I think especially as you heard in the beginning presentation, there's a fish consumption advisory, and Franny previously demonstrated that there were findings of presence of this compound on some species. We really would like to be able to answer the public's question and what does the science tell us on the toxicity and the human health effects. So we'll do, this is sort of like a backup plan with you all, and perhaps we may be on this route and we get EPA's results. I don't think it's a waste of effort. This is an important information, and there are new studies that should be integrated.
Well, I mean, clearly we've delayed awaiting this report that's now done. It just seems very wasteful not to get it. And I think the approach you're taking, which is to go through Region 4 and to headquarters both, is wise, because you've got Office of Water is actually where the staff member is, Beth, rather than Region 4. I'm assuming she's still in Cincinnati, which is where she was. Do you know?
I'm not sure where she's
Okay.
located now.
She was located in Cincinnati, so I don't know that Region 4 will have much influence versus Office of Water. So,
I think the difference is Region 4 can represent a state like North
Yes,
Carolina is
that's right.
important. So they have done that. And we've been in touch with Oasis, their new office up in DC. So I'm encouraged that the feedback we got was positive.
Okay.
And perhaps they're tied up in other things. We just haven't been able to get it yet.
Yeah, I guess I would be hesitant to have the board commit to do another review when there's one ready to go. So it just doesn't seem like an efficient use of anyone's time, but okay, thank you. You are pursuing it, I think, appropriately.
Before I get to Elena, just for clarification, the July request hasn't been answered yes or no yet, right?
I have not gotten a response, so I don't think so.
Okay. Yeah.
So the July request, I'm sorry, the one that Franny, the one that I made, is that it? Yeah, I'm checking my emails every day and or phone calls, so
I got you.
yeah.
All right, Elena, you've been very patient.
Well, first of all, I'd largely concur with what John has said. A secondary question I would have is, do we know if any of the states that are real powerhouses in terms of having a lot of talk staff, like Texas, Minnesota, there are just a couple that come to mind. Do we know if any of them are in the process of driving? And again, just as a backup. And then the other comment I would have is that I think it would be worth it for us, for the studies that have come out since we last had any to look at. I think it would be worth the board's time to at least look at those original studies. It doesn't seem like there are many of them. And I would personally be interested in seeing them if they could be made available. And I don't think that's a bad use of the board's time, because it will help us to have familiarity with the original work when we eventually hopefully do get EPA's assessment. But I wouldn't at this time say it would make sense to carve a path forward that is more labor intensive, other than making the papers available for those who want to read them.
Yeah, you make a good point with regard to that's the foundation, whether we did it or EPA does it, and you would like to have a look at the foundational document. So that does seem like a one among maybe more prudent steps forward. Others with questions for DEQ or feedback on their requests?
Tom, I do want to let the board know of a new update at the federal level. You all may be aware of EPA's program called UCMR, Unregulated Contaminants Monitoring Rule. The latest UCMR 6 proposal came out, and in that proposed 6 unregulated contaminant monitoring rule, and I can have Franny send a link to this, does include PFMOA as one chemical that's been added along with other PFAS that would be required to be monitored by drinking water systems that are subject to the monitoring rule. It is for a period of, let me just take a look at the years. It will go on between 2027 and 2031. This will allow more data as the presence of this chemical across the nation, but really we think it is more of a North Carolina issue as it is a signature compound from our manufacturing facility.
Gotcha. How do folks feel about the interrelated request to look at the immunotoxicological studies that came out of the consent order for this compound, which would be, I mean, in my way of thinking, looking at the new studies seems prudent because even if somebody else's synthesis lands in our lab, looking back at the primary studies in those would be a good foundation. And there's not many. And there's one, Conley et al., that's going to be the driver. So having a deep dive into that, like we got from the author, could be helpful. But if you have one whole animal study that provides enough endpoints with which to derive a reference dose, if that was our conclusion, and you knew that there were two more that were available in-house waiting for us to review them, it would seem like that'd be worth providing some assistance on as well. So how do folks feel about that, which would be a slightly different charge, or maybe a reordering of work instead of diving into deriving a benchmark dose? Jamie?
I think it will be really important to review the data from the consent order immunotoxicity studies. I know when Dr. Nelson had presented it in the past, the interpretation of the contractor may have led us to believe that there were no findings. So I think it would be really good for us to look at the data themselves and reach our own conclusions based on the data, not on the study author interpretations of those data.
So just to give you a point of clarification, because I probably didn't make it very clear, what we have from the lab is the final laboratory report. And so it's all of the information about the experiment and all of the data and tables and the figures they've made. There's no electronic data currently. That doesn't mean we can't convert it to an electronic format, but it is a very comprehensive file. It's not just a case narrative. So, just FYI.
Just, when it gets down to cost benefit for staff time and things like that, what's the utility of having a reference dose in hand, whether or not it came from the board or EPA? Maybe another way to say it is how much of a regulatory or guidance limitation is its absence?
We're in an unknown area, Tom. As we know, the EPA is changing its acceptance of federally approved scientific studies for regulatory decision making. They have as you mentioned, a different organization. They're reviewing the current or the previous method and perhaps even revising how these health assessment studies are done. I think from a practical perspective, this is more of a useful tool in the event the state of North Carolina needs it in order to create some decisions related to what is a safe level in water, in fish, in other exposures to the public. So it's as you know for 3 years, it's been the limiting factor that actually connects the science with the practical use of the results with any kind of regulatory or public health decision making. And so it is a parameter that is an important aspect towards what the state can do.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let me get to 3 questions and then I'll ask another one. So I think it might be Elena, Detlef, and then Jamie.
Okay, this is just a point of clarification for me. Basically, does having this number in hand enable you to, if there are exceedances, to provide forms of relief for affected residents, like water and like bottled water, or removal devices or things like that.
It's a really good point you're making, but we do have a process. The consent order allows us that if a well is over 10 parts per trillion on PFMOAA, then they already would get all the relief from the consent order.
Oh,
The
that's great
more
to-
important aspect is it is the primary pollutant that is triggering alternate water in the Lower Cape Fear. So we're looking at perhaps, and don't quote me, at least 25% of that chart that I showed you with the red dots are due to PFMOAA exceedances above 10 parts per trillion. From a environmental planning perspective, we know that's not the only exposure route. There's fish, there's thermal exposure you heard a little earlier. There's in fish that people do consume. So holistically, does this compound have additional aspects to it that we need to consider across the state because it is so prevalent? And at least some indications are that its toxic effects should be highlighted. In fact, it was one of what we call key 5 the chemicals that were identified in the consent order. And that's what Franny's talking about, is that the company was required to do this toxicity assessment. It's taking a long time. And perhaps we do have the data to accelerate that.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
That clarifies it for me.
And Detlef and then Jamie.
Yeah, maybe a couple of things. One is, we published a paper late last year that looked at serum levels in historical samples from Wilmington from about 2010 to 2016, when people were drinking the water that had high levels of PFMOAA in it, and PFMOAA was actually the dominant PFAS in the serum of people in Wilmington at that time. So what we therefore know is that it also bioaccumulates in people. Based on the concentrations we measured in drinking water, they were drinking probably on the order of 100 micrograms per liter. So very high concentrations that led to then also very high levels in serum. But it adds to the body of evidence that ultra short chain PFAS are accumulating readily in the serum of people. And if we would measure all of our blood right now, probably trifluoroacetic acid would be the dominant PFAS in all of us. So just pointing out that apart from the animal studies, there are 2 or 3 papers from the US and China that have looked at bioaccumulation of PFMOAA in people. And then the question is, when do you think the consent order tox studies will become publicly available?
The 90-day tests or the 28-day tests?
Well, we can maybe ask separately, yeah.
When I finish my review.
Okay.
But the 90-day tests are still years away?
At least a year, I would say.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
And Jamie, you had a question or a comment?
I was just going to mention the paper that Detlef co-authored, but he already mentioned it.
Gotcha. I have a question of board members for how we did this. Deriving a reference dose was a step in coming up with a health goal, provisional health goal for Gen X. At that time, a couple of our board members were employed by EPA, and it was my sense that they worked with staff that they knew to have the benchmark dose modeling done in conjunction with DEQ staff, some of whom aren't here anymore because they've moved on to other things. So now the question after that is, if the board was asked to serve on, some members of the board asked to serve on a team to look at the benchmark dose modeling for at least one study that we think that would support it, the Conley et al. Paper. Is that doable? Do folks have access to the software and the expertise to derive it, given place in life right now versus where we were when we actually did that for a whole bunch of endpoints associated with Gen X? Does anybody feel like they could do it or help somebody do it? I'm asking because I don't know. I've never done it.
I have done it. In fact, we did it in the last paper, 2 papers on a series of PFAS before I retired. The software is freely available. And I've used it, though frankly not since I retired. But so I'd be capable of helping or reviewing, certainly.
Any other comments on that question that I posed besides Elena's? Thanks for the feedback.
I haven't used the software in quite some time, but I've certainly reviewed results. So I could be a reviewer, but not run it.
Mm-hmm. And when we did it with Gen X, do I have it right that we put EPA and DEQ staff together so that there'd be like a training component of that? Franny wasn't here, so she can't answer. It would be John or Elena, I think, that helped do the Gen X work.
Might have been Elena, it wasn't me.
Maybe Kennedy's got the answer.
Everyone, so it was actually DHHS staff. So it was our, if y'all recall, Beth Dittman, Jamie Pritchett, Crystal Lee Powell Jackson, myself are the ones that worked on that.
So, second question then, would y'all that have been through it once, although it was 2018-ish, be available or not? Or is that a discussion offline for DEQ and DHHS in terms of like, if a work group was made to crank out, you wouldn't have to say all of it, but to get started at least on the one study that the board may conclude is an adequate foundation?
And that would probably be a conversation for DHHS and DEQ offline on that.
Mm-hmm. But there are folks in state government that have experience running the software and plugging in the doses and getting the points of departure from those.
Myself at this point, unfortunately, like we were talking about other turnover, the other folks are no longer at DHHS. But
oh, I gotcha.
But yes, I am here and I have experience.
Gotcha. All right. Well, any other questions or general feedback before we revisit the last couple of slides of Franny and propose a path forward? Elena, do you have a question or is that a legacy hand up?
No questions, further questions for me.
It's gone. All right. So let's look at there was a charge and then 2 questions, and then there's kind of a third question I think that came in, which was board availability to help with reviewing the mammalian tox. So is this a charge that you're giving us or a charge you're thinking about giving us given the next couple of questions?
This, I guess, would be the charge based on the previous language, and it was, this essentially was the ask before, and so much time going by and having the discourse with EPA, we figured it would be more prudent to have this conversation of like availability and bandwidth, and if there is I guess the interest or desire or even just reviewing the studies that could be incorporated in that EPA assessment when we do get it in the future.
Okay. Well, you can drop that slide out again. Now I've got my mind around it,
Okay.
just so I can see people. So what do folks think about the first one? I'm going to say that the charge is only doable with component parts. You got to have the bandwidth. You have to review the studies. You'd have to do the work. So the first question is, what's the availability to refresh the literature review, which was the foundation of the last response to the charge. The response to the 22 charge that came in 23 was based on a literature review. Brandy's first question is, what's people's availability to review the literature? And I think it was Elena who said, would like to start with that anyway. Would like to see the papers. John?
I just think we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit here. I was hoping that we would get the EPA assessment and not have to do any of this. So
I guess I'm drawing a distinction between looking at the papers and doing the benchmark dose modeling.
I'm trying to distinguish between using an assessment that's already been done and gone peer reviewed versus doing any additional work.
But even if you were looking at that peer review study, wouldn't you want to maybe go back and look at some of the papers that were available in it to see how you felt about looking at EPA's?
I wouldn't. I would just accept EPA's assessment.
I got you. Other opinions or perspectives on availability or desirability of looking at what looked to be maybe a half a dozen additional papers, one of which we've had a presentation on, and the other ones some new effect methodologies and the like.
So Tom, before I get into that, my rationale here is that if, for example, next week, Sushma gets the document from EPA, it's gone through the whole peer review process, it's a finished EPA document. It seems to me the issue is now the state begins to use that to apply, and we get asked the question about how it's actually used in anything that would support the state. If that doesn't happen, then you end up with this question that is related to the charge that we've got here. So I'm kind of torn about committing to anything until we know what's going to happen with the EPA document.
Yeah.
If the EPA document comes in, if you say you're going to revisit new studies, that really raised the question about using an existing document. And that would be, say, well, this could be another option to do benchmark dose modeling for a new study that wasn't included in that document. Well, then you're not talking about using the EPA document anymore. You're talking about having a whole other document that has to go through peer review. It's a significant delay in time for the state to have something to work with to actually employ some control equipment or some control thoughts to. So there's a time disconnect here that's a significant one.
Mm-hmm. But there's been a time disconnect of about a year where this board could have been looking at the Conley et al. Study as well.
Yeah.
I see Deputy Secretary Mace-Moore and then Elena.
Yeah, John raises a good point. I mean, we run into this all the time, right? Why recreate the work when good valued work product may be available? The board could consider maybe, I'm just throwing this out. We give maybe another couple of months until the next board meeting, or give yourself some finite, do or don't do kind of a timeline. If we don't get it from EPA or no response or partial response, we could delay any kind of decision making from the board to the next meeting or something in between. I'm not sure the response will change because we've been waiting for a while, but I'm more positive a couple months ago than I was ever last year. The intent is there. They just need to follow through. So John, I hear you. We could give another couple of months and elevate it again and then see whether we get it. And if not, I think we shouldn't wait any longer. And then we may want to at least begin the process in case we never get it.
And Elena?
I don't really disagree with John, but I still want to see those papers and have a chance to look at them. I do that for everything. So if I'm asked to, you know, about a particular compound, if you've got key studies like, you know, 2 or 3 or 4, I want to see the original data. That's just,
all.
and I don't think, and I don't think, I mean, you can just
Yeah.
make it voluntary. So if somebody wants to look at it, really, why shouldn't they? It's not committing the whole board. It's simply giving board members the option to take a look at what other studies have come out.
I hear you.
I think
Even
that's
if
a
it
good
was
thing.
just to put all those 6 studies into 2 bins of, I would do benchmark dose modeling on these and I wouldn't on these, to help inform the next question about how big that lift is.
Well, not even that. It's really more get a total picture of what does the database for this compound look like. And to me, that should include the NAMs, even though they have historically not been used for numerical. They've historically been used as supporting information. I still think it's good to have looked at them.
So how about this? Because I've heard different things. When the board went to every 4-month meeting schedule, that does mean that some things that are delayed, might be significantly delayed. There's no reason we couldn't, gather up in 2 months and have a check-in on this. But see if 1 through 4, how this sounds as a proposal moving forward. 1 is that we schedule a meeting, an off regular schedule for 2 months from now to regroup on PFMOA, and that's the only topic unless something else comes up.
I don't think so.
And then number 2 would be that we've got the citations. Franny or I can send the actual PDFs for the papers that are there to any board members who would like to review them, but you don't have to. But you've got the benefit of an updated literature search, which, recall, in our statement back to DEQ from 2023, we encouraged them to continue to update the literature. So we would be, anybody that wants to could look at those studies after Franny and I circulate them. 3 is that within those 2 months, hopefully sooner, DEQ and DHHS could talk about the ability to share the staff within DHHS that has the benchmark dose modeling experience from doing it with Gen X, so that it was maybe a revisitation of the question to the board of bandwidth for the board to do it versus bandwidth of the board to help or be part of a team that includes the state in that effort as well. That we would have an answer on it instead of putting people on the spot. And for anybody who also wants to volunteer either now or within like a week or so, let Franny know their availability to help review the PFMOA mammalian immunotox data that's available from the consent order studies, which is mammalian toxicity data for a compound that seems not data rich. So that when we regroup in a couple of months, maybe we'll have the benefit of knowing the utility of that in using it for a benchmark dose, because that won't be an EPA's document. So us getting our mind around whether the consent order studies would have pushed EPA's number one way or the other could be independently useful. So interim meeting, DHHS and DEQ talk about availability of staff. Franny or I share papers. People voluntarily review them, regroup in 2 months, see where we are. We'll either have EPA's document and can frame a charge to review that and use it, or we won't and can revisit the charge to take it on ourselves. Any comments or concerns or suggestions about that as a 4-step path moving forward? Elena?
Makes sense to me.
If I can recall all the steps, it makes sense to me too.
Does that path work for DEQ that brought this to us today?
It does, John. This is a reasonable path forward. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you.
I don't think we need to vote on it. Is there any more comments on it or major dissension? Think we'd have to vote on it if we were taking on the charge or if we were denying the charge, but we're basically delaying a decision on it until we get a little bit more information, a little bit more time to get EPA's document, time for those that want to dig into the data to go ahead and start doing it, time to find out what the availability of state resources are for this, and time to do something that we're not going to get out of EPA related to the same compound, which is to help Franny review the studies that are in-house. Well, since I heard that was okay from DEQ and there's no dissension, I'll wait like 5 more seconds. Everybody on board? Okay enough?
Tom, can I ask one question?
Yeah, you bet.
So we have a lot of state expertise and federal expertise. They may be aware of other folks that may be able to do the benchmark dose modeling and other, latest scientific use of a process and procedures for doing this. So if Detlef or Jamie or any of you all think that we need to broaden it with perhaps some other experts who may be willing and interested in working as a team to support the state's work, I wanted to just open that opportunity up too. We don't have to limit it to just DEQ or DHHS. We welcome other academic partners in the state or even across to bring talent and expertise, so we're not gap filling and struggling. But so think about that when we meet again on this topic.
All right. Well, thanks for bringing it back around to the board. And Franny and I worked on those 4 steps, which will allow some progress to be made while we're waiting. And like John, Elena, maybe everybody, I'm hopeful too that we'll just get the document in response to your July request here shortly and can take off on that direction. All right, that brings us to the last agenda item, which is a presentation from Kennedy Holt on dermal PFAS exposures. We've not had a deep dive into this at all previously, but it has come up, at least in terms of questions from the public or in the uncertainty analysis of other sections. So Kennedy's an environmental toxicologist with the Occupational and Environmental Epidemiology section in the Division of Public Health at DHHS. And he's going to give us an overview of the literature.
Thanks for that, Tom. Yeah, let me just share and get everything set up real quick. All right, so y'all should be able to see my screen, and then all right,
That looks
y'all
good.
see. All right, perfect. All right, so hello everyone. Kennedy Holt, as Tom said, environmental toxicologist with DHHS, and We have for y'all today is kind of an overview of the dermal exposures questions we received from PFAS in regards to concerns we've heard from communities and data that has become available that has continued to elevate these concerns, and our review of the literature and studies that have informed us as we've continued to think about this question and talk about those concerns with DEQ and other partners across the state. So just briefly, just to orient us, this is just a general overview of what we'll be going through, kind of what I talked about, background, some of the key studies we found, and what is current steps, current status of PFAS and dermal here at DHHS. So with PFAS dermal concerns, we are frequently asked about this from the public about health risks related to PFAS. We know that PFAS is present in, unfortunately, present in groundwater supply wells, public water supplies, and private wells across the state. So public continues to have questions about them. There have also been studies produced from Jeff Enders and Clean Cape Fear at North Carolina State, where they have looked at PFAS in foam from the Lower Cape Fear region. So this is sea foam that they've collected from beaches in and around the area. And then there's been other work done where there has been private wells sampled in and around fire departments by DEQ, again showing some pretty high levels of PFAS in communities across the state. However, one of the things that seems to be a running issue with PFAS is there's limited data on the dermal front to help us determine what those risks may actually be. Sorry, my thing's not coming forward. There we go. And to that point, there are to our knowledge, there are no dermal thresholds from any federal agencies or other states to guide health recommendations. So there's no there's no drinking water standard like there are MCLs for PFAS. So there's nothing like that for dermal that we are aware of. Again, one of the constant issues is toxicity values. So reference doses or cancer slope factors are not available for all PFAS. There are some like PFOA, Gen X, some of the other ones that have MCLs and limits that do have these toxicity values. But for by and large, a large chunk of the PFAS that we detect, those toxicity values do not exist, which impedes our ability to quantitatively evaluate them. And it's specifically in the dermal space, dermal permeability coefficient is not readily available for a lot of PFAS. And what this permeability coefficient is it's a variable that when we're calculating risk for dermal exposures, it basically is the variable that allows us to estimate, determine how much of a compound is, or the rate that the compound is going through the skin. And so it allows us to calculate the dose that may be received from any exposure from a dermal exposure. But while there is limited data in this, one of the compounds, PFOA, has really been the most studied compound within PFAS in respect to dermal exposure. So with that, I'm going to kind of go through some of the key studies that have been identified that have looked at this issue and kind of the key points here. This is not a comprehensive going through every piece of information from the studies, but I was pulling out some of the main points here from these studies when looking at them. So first, there's this Frasano et al. From 2005. It was looking at PFOA in both rat and human epidermal membranes. It was the model they were using. They specifically were using the ammonium salt of PFOA in their application for the dosing. And they use what's called an infinite dosing procedure during their tests. And what infinite dosing is when you apply for these dermal exposures is when you apply an amount to the surface of the dermal model that you're using that you would not expect that the chemical in that amount applied to be fully absorbed during the time period of your study. So effectively, there's an infinite dose that could be administered to that model during the time frame of the study. And so one of the key findings they had was that the solution that they applied to the dermal models, there was a larger permeability in the rat models versus the human models, which is largely consistent across studies, as we'll kind of see that have looked at this issue, where mice or rodent studies largely absorbed a greater dose than the human models did. And that's a pretty consistent finding across studies. And from their work, they were able to determine a permeability coefficient for PFOA of 9.5 times 10 to the negative 7 centimeters per hour was what they determined from their work. And really, the kind of punchline that they had was that they determined that dermal exposures could be relevant in occupational settings with high concentrations. And the reason they made that conclusion in the end was their time frame of exposure was an 8-hour to replicate that occupational scenario. So they did that 8-hour exposure there. So that was their main takeaway from their study. Next, we have another study, Franco et al. From 2012. They use mice, and then they use live mice, mouse epidermis, and then human epidermis models. So they had 3 different models that they used throughout their exposures. What they saw was that PFOA levels that measured within the serum after the serum in mice, and then with the solution that the epidermis was sitting in. So what they saw was that the serum PFOA levels increased with the dose that was applied to the models itself, and it was statistically significant that they saw this trend across all 3 models that they did. They also saw that in the human skin models, that the PFOA that was absorbable was different depending on the full thickness or just the epidermis models. And so you can see here in the full thickness human models that the PFOA, 69% of the PFOA was absorbed. And in the epidermis only models, only 48% of the PFOA was absorbed. And what in their discussion, they talked about this, and what they said was that the epidermis models may not be accounting for everything that's happening, and that there may be some type of reservoir mechanism happening in a full thickness skin model where the PFOA was being held within somewhere in the dermal layer. They also showed in their work, they applied the PFOA solution at different pHs, that they were able to see that the pH was shown to impact the permeability coefficient pretty significantly. As I said here, 3 orders of magnitude. And this kind of going from and I have it subbullet here, where it's the physiologically relevant permeability coefficient was measured at 5.8 times 10 to the negative 5th centimeters per hour. And what I meant by physiologically relevant was that the pH was at 5.5 in that solution, which was their highest pH that they used in their studies. The other pH was I think 2.5 was what they showed in that, and that was not really considered relevant because most water is not to be at pH 2.5, and so that's why it was stated as most physiologically relevant. Another point, so they were not just looking at how much PFOA was absorbed in their studies, they were trying to look at different potential health indicators or impacts on dermal layers or the skin. And what they saw, they were measuring inflammatory response in the skin for their different models. And what they saw is that the PFOA was not significantly different from acetone controls when looking at inflammatory response markers in the models that they were using in their studies. So again, it did not seem, based on their work, that there was any type of inflammatory damage that was at least different from acetone controls, based on what they were looking at. And so similarly to Branzano paper, that they conclude that PFOA exposure via the dermal route may be a concern, potentially at higher levels here. They at least were able to measure that permeability coefficient and see that PFOA was present in serum post dermal exposures. So next we have Hall et al. From 2024. This study used porcine skin models, so pig skin, as a I'll say a representative model for human skin, looking at PFOA, PFHXA, and PFBA. And they did 10 replicates for PFOA and PFHXA and only 6 for PFBA. And I don't know why they did not really expand upon that, but that was what was stated. They used a dosing system similar to what Franco et al. Used. So they were trying to recreate that exposure scenario, that methodology. And they, kind of like Franzano, they did an 8-hour exposure duration to replicate occupational exposure scenario. And what they measured as their final dermal permeability was 8.28 times 10 to the -5 centimeters per hour. So again, within the same order of magnitude as the Franco et al. Paper that was just discussed. Again, this is kind of seeing a pattern here. They conclude that PFAS measured permeate the skin during their exposure period, and that they may represent an exposure risk at higher levels. And again, the part that was interesting to me is that they measured a permeability coefficient that was along the same lines as the Franco et al. Team. So it seemed like there was some concurrence there, even though they used different models. So then next paper I have here is Ragnarsdottir et al. From 2024. They use in vitro 3D human skin models for exposure. They applied 500 nanograms per centimeter squared of target PFAS. So they were looking at multiple PFAS here. They were not just looking at PFOA. They were looking at a variety of different PFAS here. And so they applied this to each of the to each skin tissue. They applied this and they used methanol as their solvent for delivery, which is different from water and acetone that was used in some of the previous studies. They also measured the receptive fluid, so the fluid that the skin models were sitting in. They sampled it at fixed intervals to see how that level changed over time. And then they looked at the distribution of target PFAS measurements based on the absorbed amount, the unabsorbed amount, and what was retained within the skin tissue. And one of the key findings that was interesting from their work is they found that shorter chain PFAS are more readily absorbed than longer chain PFAS. This is to my knowledge and what I found in the literature, this is while this makes sense from just thinking about what we know about PFAS and their chemical structures, this makes sense. But this is one of the first times where I've seen actual quantitative numbers that could put that in perspective in terms of looking at these PFAS and how they differ in terms of absorption rates. And again, their dermal permeability they measured for PFOA was actually a lot larger than what was measured in Hall and Franco et al., where they measured PFOA, the dermal permeability to be 3.82 times 10 to the negative 3 centimeter per hour. They didn't really go into much about why that would be different. I mean, obviously, the model using an in vitro 3D human skin model could be different from those models that were used by Hall and Franco et al., which were models that they were basically skin, dermal and epidermal samples that were taken from animals in those. So it could be a difference between the differences in models, but they didn't really go much more into that. One thing I also wanted to mention is I mentioned that this paper measured several different PFAS. I did not necessarily include them here because a lot of them were the first studies. There was only an N of 1 in terms of looking at those studies, in terms of not really any other studies had looked at those before. So the information's there and interesting if y'all, if anybody from the board would like to look at that further, but I just didn't include it because I was trying to be just keeping it narrow on PFOA, since there was a lot of information specifically on that particular PFAS. And then lastly, there was, as we talked about other groups, through some of our other conversations, other groups that have looked and what they have determined through information that's available. So this paper from et al. From 2025, it was actually a review article where they looked at the studies that were available for PFAS and looking at what is potentially the best information that could be used at this time if somebody wanted to use it going through. So they were specifically they targeted PFOA, looking at dermal permeability. They went through their process and summarized the strengths and limitations of 4 human model studies. And they specifically mentioned only looking at human models, and their rationale is that they existed and they wanted to focus on human models instead of animal models. And they just kind of left it at that. But kind of after applying their process and going through that, they identified the Franco et al., the 2012, as having the most physiologically relevant permeability factor. The Rodney-Stoddard et al. Paper was a second, without putting my finger on the scale, that I was kind of their second choice. But the Franco et al. 2012 paper was what they determined to be the most relevant study currently. And they primarily base this on the appropriateness of the pH and the solvent selection employed in their methodology. The Rodney-Stoddard paper did not measure pH or report it in their study, so they weren't able to evaluate that. And so it was kind of the proverbial black mark on their record during the evaluation. So that's kind of a overview, again, of the relevant studies that we've looked at from here. And so kind of what the current status of things, given this information, is that, again, one of the consistent findings, at least throughout all the papers, was that studies seem to suggest that dermal absorption may represent an important route of exposure in some scenarios. And this would be more of some of those scenarios where we're seeing high levels of PFAS in water, is where that may be an important route of exposure. DHHS is currently drafting qualitative language to address questions regarding to PFAS exposures, specifically at PFOA that occur via dermal contact. And we are working closely with DEQ to coordinate information and messaging to ensure that we're providing consistent and usable information to folks impacted by PFAS and PFOA across North Carolina. And at that, I'm happy to answer any questions folks may have.
Thank you, Kennedy. Are there questions from board members or other staff? Or Kennedy?
Before, is it all right if I stop sharing? I can pull it back off if people want, just so I can see folks and everything.
That's a good idea. Elena?
I had a question in regards to the Hall et al. Reference that you cited.
Mhm.
How different were the dermal permeability component coefficients among the different chemicals?
Are you talking about let me pull up the study real quick. Don't have that off the top of my head, but I can pull up the study real quick and let you know.
And we'll get to Detlef next.
If Detlef wants to ask this question, why I sit here and pull this up real quick. Just
Okay, if you want to multitask.
yes.
I might have missed it, but a lot of people ask when about the exposure during showering. So at higher temperatures, how important is the temperature? And and I think skin pores open up when you have a warmer environment. And just curious about whether people looked at that in detail.
I did not see anything related to temperature in any of the studies. I know we have gotten questions about the volatilization of PFAS, but there was nothing in the studies that indicated anybody measuring temperature or looking at that. They were all direct application to skin, and there were no reported temperatures to my knowledge.
Yeah. I think that's still an important data gap. I have a feeling if you take a hot shower, your skin may become a little bit more permeable.
Yeah.
If I might jump in.
Yeah,
sure.
That's very true. It's particularly where it's been well studied are the trihalomethanes, including chloroform and like that, where you also have to be concerned with volatilization. But even in the heavier brominated THMs, temperature makes a difference. So as a general trend, it certainly is an important question, and I would agree with it as a data gap.
Elena, just wanted to get back to your original question in terms of differences in the Hall study with the permeability coefficients. So for PFBA, their permeability coefficient was 2.54 times 10 to the negative fourth. And then for PFHXA, sorry, I'm getting tongue-tied, it's 1.72 times 10 to the negative 4. So an order of magnitude less than order of magnitude greater than the PFOA.
Okay, thank you.
No problem.
I dropped in the chat a recent review of exposure data that didn't go into the mechanistics, but it might be useful for comparing what they synthesized for exposures relative to risk communication based on the centimeters, the units of transfer across the skin. Because that paper that Haywood et al., which I've downloaded a PDF of and can send it to anybody that wants it, it has the Franco, the Yay, if that's how you say it, 2025, and that Ragnas Dodier et al. 2024. They're all in that paper. It's not my area of expertise, so I don't know if it'll be useful, but it's a recent synthesis that's trying to look at the maybe a bottom line of, does the exposure matter?
Yeah, that'll be helpful to just add to the body of literature, like you're saying, in terms of what people may be experiencing from an exposure level, at least. And then, like you said, applying the mechanistic and quantitative risk assessment pieces to that. So thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any idea why that Ragnus Dodia paper has a exposure or a transfer number that's 2 orders of magnitude different than the other 3 that you shared?
I'm not sure because they didn't really go into it, but I would be, based on what I've seen from some of the pHs. So pointing to the Franco paper where they measured different pHs, and I've seen some other papers that have had their pHs reported. The pH really seems to be impacting whether or not, or I guess the permeability of PFAS across it. And since it was not reported in their paper, that could be one piece too. One of the differences as well that was pointed out, and I would agree with, is they use methanol as the solvent for PFOA in theirs. And most of the other papers use either water or acetone as the solvent, and so that could be playing a part into it as well. And that is something that is discussed in a few of the papers, talking about how potentially solvents could be impacting the transport of these PFAS across as well. And it just needs to be something that needs to be, to know for sure, it needs to be studied more specifically looking at this, because most of the papers only use one solvent, I'll say. They don't do, Franco was, I think, one of the only ones that used multiple, like acetone and water on it. And so if a study was developed that applied the same dosing methodology, but using different solvents, you could maybe better answer that question. But those are just my postulations. I don't have anything concrete on that.
I gotcha. Other questions or comments for Kennedy? Anything you need from the board beyond the attention that you got today in the article?
I don't think so at this time. I don't think we have any specific asks. We were mainly wanting, since we know that the board receives questions or is aware of what the public engagement is, and both the EQ and DHHS are working on this issue, and we are trying to make sure that we are showing that we are addressing and considering these concerns that we're hearing from the public, and kind of what the status of things are right now. And kind of driving that point that our two agencies are in communication and making sure that we're evaluating things appropriately and being able to provide good guidance and information to North Carolinians based on what we know.
Yeah, great. Very good.
And I'll just briefly add, thanks, Kennedy, for the presentation. If you are aware of any papers coming out or efforts that we should be aware of, please let us know, because I know you all are following these topics. So thanks.
Great. Well, that brings us to the end of the presentations and the part of the agenda, which is for public comment. We didn't have any signed up at the beginning of the meeting, and that's probably the answer. But I guess I'll check with Stephen or Franny that can see the queue or the questions.
So there is one person that has signed up, and I need to refresh the form, but the person that has signed up does appear to be in attendance. Let me just check. Her name is Kelly McConnell, and I'm going to elevate her to a panelist just so we can unmute her. Kelly, if you are available to make your public comment now, you're welcome to unmute yourself. If not, I will just look at the list again. Oh, please.
Can you hear me?
We can. Welcome.
Yes. Okay. Hi. Yeah. I'm Kelly McConnell. I am the chair of the local Cape Fear Sierra Club and do a lot of work with North Carolina Sierra Club. I'm actually also running for office for soil and water, but my background is as a pediatrician. So I care about this stuff a lot. And this is the first time I've been able to attend this board meeting. And I just wanted to say that I really, really appreciate that we have people taking the time and effort to look into this. So many people come up to me with concerns about PFAS and PFOAS and all sorts of other concerns. So I just, yeah, we need more research and but really we need to figure out how to stop these chemicals from getting into our water until we have a better way of managing it and can really show that it doesn't hurt us, which looks like there's a lot of risk that these things do hurt us. So I just wanted to share that and thank you guys for taking the time and effort to look into this.
Thank you for your comments. We appreciate it. And thanks for attending the meeting today.
Yeah, thank you.
So Franny, anyone else?
I don't have anyone else signed up.
Okay. Then before we entertain a moment to adjourn, a motion to adjourn, I guess I'll just thank Franny for work on the agenda again with the agency leaders. Thank Stephen for being our IT person today. Everything ran smoothly, at least on my end, so thanks so much. We had 90% of the board attending, so thanks to all the board members that attended. I'll run through what I consider to be the action items. We'll have the April meeting minutes, which we voted to finalize, put on the website. I got to make sure I understand some of my notes here. If there's any additional comments on the PFAS report that was the subject of PFOS with PFOS, that was the subject of Dr. Guidry's presentation, please has those turned in by August 19th. Send those to Drs. Guidry's, Moore, Nilsson, and me. I'll give DEQ, I guess, the action item of working on changing the bios. We've given everybody plenty of time to get those in, and be good to get those freshened up. We will probably do a poll to schedule an interim call as a check back in on PFMOAA. Either Franny or I'll distribute the papers that were referenced in her presentation as new PFMOAA literature. No obligation to review them, but as Elena indicated, the opportunity to review them. If you're interested in volunteering to help Franny review the consent order studies related to mammalian toxicology, please let her know that. And DEQ, DHHS will have some discussions about availability of staff time to do a benchmark dose modeling, be part of a team so that we'll have an answer on that when we regroup, and hopefully we'll have EPA's document before then. I'll remind people that we have a regularly scheduled meeting on December 2nd. This other one would be an interim meeting focused on PFMOAA with a check back in on where things stand with EPA and anything that anybody's learned from those couple of groups that we talked about. Any questions or input from board members before we entertain a moment to adjourn?
The last comment I might make it back to Sushma's comment about getting the document from EPA. It may also be if you don't get any information back, you're waiting. Besides going to the Office of Water or Region 4, you might even consider our senators, because oftentimes that gets attention. So, but that would be at the political level from within the state. So, say that state pressure sometimes to the senators yields results, in my experience. Okay.
All right, then it would be appropriate to entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All right, all in favor? Just raise your hands this time. Very good. I left you a quote there from somebody who was really smart, Albert Einstein, on the value of science in society. We talk a lot about uncertainty. We have a lot of uncertainty, but we also have a lot of good things going in science to help guide a better future for our people and our environment. Thank you all for your time and your participation, and we will send some notes out about this and regroup on those action items. Take care, folks.
All righty. To see you
Thank
all.
you, Tom. Thank you, everybody.